He chose her while I sacrificed everything. Reincarnated, I refused to see the Alpha King again. She had not slept in 3 days. Lyra sat on the cold stone floor of the corridor outside Kaelin's war chamber, her back pressed against the wall, her fingers curled around a cup of tea that had gone cold hours ago. She had brewed it herself, because no one else had thought to, just as no one else had thought to send word to the northern commanders, or to check that the supply wagons had left before sunrise, or to read the 40 pages of peace proposals that had arrived from the eastern provinces the night before. She had done all of it. She always did. Inside the chamber, she could hear Kaelin's voice, low, steady, and measured, the way it always was when he was speaking to men whose respect he needed to keep. She had spent years listening to that voice, through walls and doors and long silences. She knew every shade of it. She knew when he was tired and hiding it, when he was angry and choosing patience, when he was frightened and wearing confidence like armor. She knew him the way a woman knows a person she has given her whole heart to, the way you know someone when you have chosen them every single day without being asked. She had chosen him every day for 6 years. 6 years was a long time. Long enough to forget who you were before someone. Long enough to build your entire life around a person, until the shape of your days became inseparable from the shape of theirs. Lyra did not think of herself as someone who had sacrificed things. She thought of herself as someone who had made choices, and those choices had simply led her here, to this cold floor, to this cup of forgotten tea, to this quiet sense of being necessary, in a way that nobody quite acknowledged out loud. She was 27 years old, and she was tired, in a way that sleep could not fix. Her name, when it was spoken at court, was usually attached to a task. Someone needed Lyra to read through the trade documents. Someone needed Lyra to speak to the general's wife about the dinner arrangements. Someone needed Lyra to handle the correspondence that had piled up, because the king was too busy to deal with it himself. They called her capable. They called her dependable. Once, a courtier had called her indispensable, and she had thought that meant something. Now she understood that indispensable was just another word for invisible. You only noticed the things that were indispensable when they stopped being there. She had met Kaelin when she was 21, and he was 24, and his kingdom was on the edge of collapse. His father had died the previous winter, leaving behind a treasury that was nearly empty, a court full of nobles who smelled weakness, and 2 border provinces that were already being circled by rival lords. Kaelin had been young and bright and visibly overwhelmed, and Lyra had been a junior records keeper in the royal archive, which meant she had access to every financial document, every land deed, every treaty and correspondence that had passed through the palace in the past 3 generations. She had walked into his private office one morning with a stack of files under her arm and a straightforward plan for how to stabilize the eastern border without going to war. She had not asked permission to come in. She had simply sat down across from him and laid out everything she knew. He had listened. That was the thing about Kaelin that she had loved first, before everything else, before the way he looked at her across a room, before the quiet conversations that stretched past midnight, before the years of closeness that made her believe she was something permanent in his life. She had loved that he listened. He was surrounded by advisors who spoke loudly and thought in narrow lines, and here was this young king who could go very quiet and actually hear what she was saying. It felt rare. She had found it extraordinary. They had worked side by side for the first 2 years without anything that could be named. It was not a romance in those early days, so much as a necessity. The kingdom needed stabilizing, and they were the 2 people in the building who understood the full picture. She worked from before sunrise to past midnight most days. She learned the names of every noble family in the 4 provinces, their alliances, their debts, their grudges, and their ambitions. She read reports so that Kaelin didn't have to read all of them. She drafted letters in his voice, because she had learned his voice so well she could write it in her sleep. She stood behind him in meetings, and watched his face, so she would know when he needed her to step in, and when he needed her to stay silent. It was somewhere in the 3rd year that something shifted. She was not sure exactly when it happened. It was not a single moment. It was more like the way light changes in a room, as the seasons turn, gradual, and then suddenly undeniable. He began finding reasons to speak to her, when there was no business to discuss. He began asking her opinions on things that had nothing to do with the kingdom. He noticed when she was tired. He brought her tea once, handing it to her with a quiet sort of shyness that she had not known he possessed, and she had looked at him, and understood that something had changed between them, and she had let it. She let it because she had already been in love with him for at least a year, and had been telling herself firmly that it was not love. It was only loyalty. It was only admiration. It was only the closeness that came from working alongside someone through very difficult circumstances. But when he handed her that cup of tea with that particular look on his face, she stopped lying to herself. They were never publicly declared. That was something she returned to in her mind often in the years that followed. The fact that nothing had ever been named. There had been no announcement, no formal acknowledgement, no moment in which Kaelin had stood before his court and said, "This woman is important to me, in a way that you should all understand and respect." It had always been private. Private dinners, private conversations, private looks across crowded rooms that she read as clearly as sentences in a book. She had told herself that the privacy was because the timing wasn't right, because the kingdom needed stability first, because there was always one more crisis to get through, before they could focus on themselves. She had been wrong about that. She understood it now, sitting on the cold floor, listening to his voice through the door. The past year had been the hardest of all of them. A drought in the southern provinces had led to food shortages, which had led to unrest, which had led to 3 separate confrontations between villages and the local guards that Lyra had spent months quietly managing so that they did not escalate into something that would require military force. At the same time, the northern lords had been renegotiating their loyalty agreements, which was a polite way of saying they were deciding how much they could demand from the crown before giving their support. Lyra had personally traveled north twice, sitting across tables from men who looked past her because she was a woman and only half listened because she had no official title, and she had talked them into terms that were actually favorable to the kingdom, through sheer patience and precision. She had not told Kaelin how difficult those meetings had been. She had presented him with the agreements, and he had looked relieved and grateful, and said she was remarkable, and she had smiled, and felt the warmth of that, and thought it was enough. She was always deciding things were enough. Meanwhile, something else had been changing in the court that she had noticed but not named. Selene had arrived 8 months ago, a woman from one of the oldest noble families in the kingdom, brought to court originally to discuss a land arrangement in the Western Territories. She was composed and graceful and very beautiful, and Lyra had observed her with the kind of careful attention she gave to everything that might affect the balance of things. She had not been threatened. That was the part that felt humiliating now in retrospect. She had actually not been threatened. She had watched Kaelin speak to Selene at court functions and thought, he is being polite. He is being diplomatic. That is what he does. She had trusted her own reading of him completely. She had believed she knew him better than anyone, and maybe she had. Maybe she had known every shade of his voice, and every gesture of his hands, and every way his expression shifted, when he was uncertain or moved, or privately amused. Maybe she had known him beautifully, and completely, and had not, apparently, known the one thing that mattered. The door opened. She looked up. One of Kaelin's senior advisors stepped out of the chamber and looked down at her with an expression she could not quite read. He said that the king was asking for her. She rose, set the cold cup down on the floor, straightened her clothes, and walked inside. Kaelin was standing near the window. The morning light was coming in sideways across the stone floor, and he looked the way he always looked when something was about to be difficult, very composed, very still, with a particular quality of silence around him that she had learned to read as the silence before a conversation that would cost something. She stood across from him and waited. He said her name. He said that he wanted to speak with her before the announcement was made, so that she would not hear it from someone else first. He said it as though this was a kindness. He said that he had been thinking carefully for some time, and that he believed the kingdom's stability required a formal alliance, and that an agreement had been reached with Selene's family, and that the betrothal would be announced to the court that afternoon. Lyra stood very still. She did not speak for a long moment. She was aware, in a distant way, of the sound of her own breathing, of the light on the floor, of the faint noise of the courtyard below. She was aware that her hands were very cold. She was aware that Kaelin was watching her with an expression that she recognized as guilt, carefully managed into composure, and that this, the managed composure, the careful announcement made to her privately as though that were enough, was the truest thing she had seen from him in a very long time. She said, "I understand." She said it clearly, and without any shake in her voice. She heard herself say it, and felt a strange split feeling, as though one part of her was watching another part of her standing in that room, being exceptionally composed about the worst thing that had ever happened to her. He said more things after that. She heard them. He said she would always be important to him. He said he hoped nothing would change in their working arrangement. He said the betrothal was a political necessity and had nothing to do with what they had meant to each other. He said it with such sincerity that she almost believed he believed it. She nodded. She thanked him for telling her. She turned and walked out of the room. She went all the way to the farthest end of the palace, to a small terrace that overlooked the garden below, and she stood there for a long time in the cold morning air. She did not cry. She was not ready to cry yet. She was still in the stage that came before crying, the stage where everything is very clear and very quiet, and you are simply understanding a thing that you did not understand before. She understood now. She understood that she had built 6 years of her life around a person who had never, in any binding or public way, chosen her back. She had been valuable to him. She had been important to him. She had been the quiet center of his working life, and perhaps, in some real sense, of his emotional life too. But being important to someone was not the same as being chosen by them. Being valuable was not the same as being loved, and she had confused those things for a very long time, because he had let her, and because she had wanted to. The courtyard below her was already filling with people going about their morning work. She watched them for a while. A boy was carrying a basket of bread from the kitchens. 2 women were crossing the yard with their heads close together in conversation. A horse was being led toward the stables, its hooves quiet on the stone. The world was continuing in its ordinary way, as it always did, indifferent to the private devastations of the people moving through it. She straightened up. She pressed her hands flat against the stone railing, felt the cold of it against her palms, and breathed slowly. She had things to do today. She always had things to do. There was a stack of correspondence on her desk. There were 3 appointments she had scheduled. There was a dinner tonight that she had organized down to the placement of the candles. She would do all of it. She would walk back inside and do all of it with exactly the same care and precision she always had. And while she was doing it, she would be quietly deciding something. She could already feel the edges of the decision forming, slow and certain, the way ice forms on still water when the temperature drops low enough. She could not stay here. She understood that now with a clarity that surprised her. Not because of anger. The anger would come later, she suspected, and it would be large, but because of something simpler and more fundamental. She could not continue to give her best to a place that had taken it so completely for granted. She could not keep being indispensable to a life that was not, in any meaningful way, her own. She stood on the terrace for another minute. The boy with the bread was gone. The 2 women had disappeared through a doorway. The horse had been put away. Then she went inside to pack. She did not pack everything. She did not want everything. She wanted only what was hers, the books she had bought herself, the small wooden box her mother had given her before she died, 3 dresses she had paid for with her own savings, and a journal in which she had written, over the course of 6 years, everything she had thought and felt and observed about the world. The journal was fat and battered, and the ink in the early pages had faded to a soft brown. She packed it last, pressing her hand against its cover for a moment before placing it in the bag. She was done in less than an hour. She sat on the edge of the bed in the room she had occupied for 4 years. A comfortable room, a good room, one of the better rooms in the palace, and she looked at the single bag by the door. It was such a small thing, to have given 6 years to a place, and to be able to fit everything that was truly yours into one bag. She thought about what she would tell people. She decided she would tell them nothing, because nothing was the truest thing. There was no explanation she could offer that would not require her to say more than she was willing to say, and she had spent enough of herself already. There was one thing left to do before she left. She went to her desk and sat down and wrote a single letter. It was not to Kalen. It was to the head of the palace records department, a careful older man named Owen, who had been her supervisor in her first year there, and who had always treated her with genuine respect. She told him that she was resigning her position effective immediately, and that she was sorry not to be able to give more notice. She told him that the archive files she had been maintaining were organized and labeled clearly, and that her successor would find them easy to work with. She thanked him for everything he had taught her. She sealed the letter, left it on her desk, picked up her bag, and walked out. She did not look back at the room. She walked the long corridor toward the servants' exit, through the back courtyard, and out through a side gate that led onto the street that ran along the south wall of the palace grounds. The city was fully awake now. The market was open. The smell of bread and wood smoke hung in the cool morning air. Horses and carts moved past. Children ran on the far side of the street. Lyra stood on the pavement for a moment, her bag in her hand, the palace behind her. She had nowhere in particular to go. She had no plan beyond this moment. But she stood very straight, and she breathed the outside air deeply, and she let herself feel the specific terror and relief of having made a decision that was entirely her own. Then she started walking. The announcement came at midday. Lyra was already 3 miles from the palace when the bells rang from the court tower. The formal bells. The ones that meant a proclamation was being made. She did not stop walking. She kept her eyes on the road ahead of her, her bag on her shoulder, her steps steady, and she let the sound of the bells fall behind her until she could not hear them anymore. She had a small amount of money. Not much, but enough. Over the years she had saved carefully. Not because she had ever planned to leave, but because she had come from a family where money was always uncertain, and the habit of saving had been in her since childhood. She had enough to rent a room somewhere in the city for a few weeks, enough to eat simply, enough to think clearly, without panic about the immediate future. She found a room that same afternoon, in a quiet street in the tradespeople's quarter, on the second floor of a house owned by a woman named Clara, who had 3 daughters, and a husband, who worked the early shift at the mill. Clara asked no questions about where Lyra had come from, or why she needed a room. She simply showed her upstairs, told her the rent, told her breakfast was available if she wanted it for an extra coin per week, and left her to settle in. The room was small, a single bed, a table with a chair, a window that looked out over the back garden. The walls were bare except for a hook near the door. It was nothing like the room she had occupied at the palace. But she sat on the edge of the bed and felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt quiet. Not the kind of quiet that meant emptiness. A different kind. The kind that comes when you step out of a noise you have been inside for so long that you stopped hearing it as noise. The palace had been loud even in its silences. Loud with expectation. Loud with the constant awareness of what was needed, and who needed it, and whether she was providing it adequately. This room had none of that. This room simply existed, without wanting anything from her, and she sat in the middle of it and breathed. Then, precisely because she was alone for the first time in what felt like years, she cried. She did not try to stop herself. She had grown up believing that crying was something you did privately and got through quickly, and did not dwell on, because dwelling on things was its own kind of weakness. But she was 27 years old, and she was sitting in a small bare room with everything she owned in one bag, and she had just left behind 6 years of her life, and the person she had quietly built those years around, and she thought that maybe this was precisely the right situation, in which to cry for as long as she needed to. She cried for a long time. She cried for the version of herself that had walked into Kalen's office at 21, with files under her arm, and a straightforward plan, and so much confidence in her own usefulness, not understanding yet that usefulness and belonging were not the same thing. She cried for the years she had given, without being asked whether she had the energy to give them. She cried for the dinners she had organized, and the letters she had written in someone else's voice, and the trips she had made to difficult men in cold northern rooms, representing a crown that had never publicly acknowledged she existed. She cried for the private moments she had held on to for years, as evidence that she was loved, those small looks and quiet conversations, and once, a cup of tea, that she had built entire libraries of meaning out of, because she had needed them to mean something. When she was finished, she washed her face in the basin on the table. She looked at herself in the small mirror above it. Her eyes were red, her face was pale. She looked like exactly what she was, a person who had just gone through something. She did not try to look otherwise. She went to sleep early that night, and she slept for 12 hours straight, which was more sleep than she had gotten in a single stretch in years. In the morning she felt different, not healed. She was not foolish enough to think that healing happened overnight, but she felt steadier. She felt as though something had been cleared, the way a room feels after you have opened all the windows and let the air move through it. She ate breakfast downstairs at Clara's table, surrounded by the cheerful noise of Clara's daughters arguing about something, and Clara herself, moving between the kitchen and the table, with complete efficient calm. And Lyra drank her tea, and let the ordinary noise of other people's lives wash over her, and thought about what came next. She was good at certain things. She knew this clearly without vanity. She could organize complex information and see the patterns in it. She could read a situation and understand what it needed before the people in it did. She could write clearly and think on her feet and manage a great deal of work without losing track of any of it. These were skills that had been used for 6 years in service of someone else's kingdom. They were still her skills. They had not been left behind in the palace with her one bag. She spent the first week in the city walking. She walked through different quarters, the market quarter, the harbor, the old craftsman's district, the newer part of town where the merchant houses were. She watched how things worked. She talked to people when they seemed willing to talk. She was gathering the same kind of information she had always gathered, except this time she was gathering it for herself, with no particular goal in mind, only the pleasure of understanding a new place. It was on one of these walks that she passed a print house. It was a small establishment, 2 windows, a door that stood slightly open, and through it the smell of ink and paper that she found immediately appealing. A sign above the door read, Halton & Sons, Printers and Publishers. She stood outside for a moment, and then, because standing outside looking at things had never been her style, she walked in. There was a man behind the counter sorting through a pile of papers. He was perhaps 60, with ink-stained hands and the kind of face that had started out severe and been softened over the decades by what appeared to be a great deal of quiet humor. He looked up when she came in without surprise, as though women wandered into his print house every morning. He said good morning. She said good morning. She asked what kind of material he published. He said, all kinds. Official notices, merchants' pamphlets, the occasional book when someone was willing to pay for it. He said business had been reasonable this year. She asked if he ever needed editorial help, someone to organize manuscripts, review correspondence, manage the production schedule. She said it in a straightforward way, the same way she had walked into Kalen's office 7 years ago with files under her arm. He looked at her for a moment with those softened, severe eyes and asked what her experience was. She said she had spent 6 years in administrative work for a significant institution and that she was very good at managing large volumes of information under time pressure. She did not mention which institution. He did not ask. He said he could offer her 3 mornings a week, to begin with, at a rate that was modest but fair. He said if the work was as good as she said, they would talk about something more regular after a month. She said that sounded reasonable, and asked when she should start. He said tomorrow was fine if she liked. She said tomorrow was fine. She went back to Clara's house and sat at the table in her small room, and opened her journal to a new page. She wrote down the name of the print house, the name of the man, Edmund Halton, the rate he had offered, and the hours. She wrote it all down in the same careful way she had always written things down, because writing things down was how she thought, how she organized the world, how she made meaning out of what was happening. Then she turned back to earlier pages and read some of what she had written in the previous years. She read it carefully and without flinching, because she believed in looking directly at things even when they were uncomfortable. She read entries from years ago, in which she had written about Kalen, with such openness and trust that it was almost painful to see now, not because she had been foolish, but because she had been so genuinely, completely present in her feeling. She had loved him the way a person loves when they have not yet learned to protect themselves from the possibility of loss. She closed the journal. She was not sure how long it would take to feel fully herself again. She was not sure what fully herself even looked like at this point, since she had been someone else's everything for so long that she was not sure where his needs ended and her identity began. But she was curious about it, in a way that surprised her. She had expected to feel more ruined. She had expected the grief to be more total. Instead, underneath the grief, she was finding something else. A tentative, quiet curiosity about what she was actually made of, when there was no one to arrange herself around. She would find out. She was certain of that much. The next morning she arrived at the print house at the agreed hour. Edmund Halton was already there, sorting the same kind of paperwork he had been sorting the day before. He showed her a desk in the back room. A good desk, solid, with enough surface space to work properly, and handed her a stack of manuscripts in need of organization and a list of correspondence that needed drafting. She sat down. She read through everything once to understand the scope. Then she started working. By noon, she had organized the manuscripts into a logical sequence, drafted 5 letters, caught 2 billing errors in the accounts ledger, and made a list of 3 changes to the production schedule that would save Edmund approximately 4 days of delay on his next major print job. She left the list on the corner of his desk with a short note explaining her reasoning. He read it. He came to the back room and stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. He said, "You have done this kind of work before." She said, "Yes." He said, "All right then," and went back to his side of the print house. She stayed until the agreed time, then collected her things and walked back to Clara's house in the afternoon light. The street was busy at this hour, children coming home, workers finishing their day, the smell of cooking beginning to drift from windows. She walked through all of it, and she felt, for the first time in many days, something that was not grief, and was not fear, and was not anger. It was something smaller, and harder to name. Something like the first indication, faint but real, that she was going to be all right. Not today, and not easily. But eventually, and on her own terms, and without giving up another piece of herself to earn it. She was going to be all right. And from deep in the back of her chest, a voice she had forgotten she had, her own voice, the one that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs or expectations, said, quietly and firmly, "Yes, you are." 3 weeks passed before the first messenger came. She had expected it sooner, honestly. She had expected someone from the palace to track her down within the first week. Not out of care, but out of practicality. There were too many things she had been managing for Kaylin that no one else fully understood. She had expected a polite request, or perhaps a less polite one, asking her to come back long enough to explain the filing system, or to finish the Northern Lord's agreement documentation, or to attend to any one of the 100 things that had been hers, and only hers. The messenger arrived one morning, while she was at the print house. He was a young man from the palace staff, carefully dressed, clearly nervous, with a sealed letter that he held out to her with both hands as though it were something fragile. She looked at the seal for a moment. She recognized it. She had handled hundreds of letters with that seal over the years. She had broken that seal herself when Kaylin was too busy, knowing the contents before he did, because that was what she did. She took the letter, thanked the young man, and waited until he was gone before she opened it. It was not from Kaylin. It was from his head secretary, a man named Gerald, who had always been polite to her in the vague and automatic way that people in powerful institutions are polite to the people around them without seeing them clearly. Gerald wrote that the palace would appreciate her assistance in transitioning her responsibilities to a new administrator. Gerald wrote that the king wished her well in her future endeavors. Gerald wrote that her final stipend payment had been released to her account at the city bank. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her bag. She went back to her desk and went on working. That evening, at Clara's table, with Clara's daughters arguing cheerfully about which of the city cats was the smartest, and Clara pouring tea for everyone without being asked, Lyra thought about the letter. She thought about the phrase "the king wishes her well in her future endeavors," thought about how clean and distant it was, how completely it erased everything she had been and done, and she waited to feel the wave of hurt she expected. It came, but it was smaller than she anticipated. Not because it didn't matter. It mattered enormously. But something in her had begun to shift. Some internal weight had begun to redistribute itself. The hurt was real, but it no longer felt like a verdict on her worth. It felt like information about his. She did not write back. She worked at the print house through the rest of the month. Edmund Halton had expanded her hours by the third week without being asked, simply adding more work to her desk each morning, because she consistently completed it before midday. She did not mind the extra work. She found, to her slight surprise, that she enjoyed it, not in the high-pressure, crisis-fueled way she had enjoyed her palace work, but in a quieter and more genuine way. She liked the smell of the place. She liked the specific kind of problem that a printer's schedule presented, which was different from political problems and in some ways more satisfying to solve. She liked Edmund, who was precise and fair, and who treated her simply as a competent person doing good work, which was, she realized, everything she had needed someone to do for years. She began to eat regularly for the first time in years. She had not noticed, while she was at the palace, how often she had skipped meals because there was something that needed to be done, or how rarely she had slept more than 5 or 6 hours because the morning always started too early. Here, she ate at Clara's table with the family, and slept in her small bare room, and walked in the evenings, and her body slowly began to remember what it felt like not to be running on the edge of itself. Her face in the mirror began to look different. Not older. Cleaner, somehow. More settled. as though the person looking back at her had arrived at something and stopped being in motion. She was not yet healed. She knew that. There were still nights when she lay in the dark and replayed things, specific moments, specific conversations, specific silences, and felt the loss of them as something physical, a dull ache in the center of her chest. There were still mornings when she woke from dreams in which everything was as it had been, and felt the transition back to reality like a fall. But she was not running. She was not pretending. She was simply living, for the first time in 6 years, in a life that was fully her own. And that was something. She was beginning to understand, quite a lot. The night she finally let herself look back was a Tuesday. She knew it was a Tuesday because Clara's daughters had their music lesson on Tuesday evenings, and the house filled with the particular kind of careful, slightly wrong notes that came from children learning instruments they were not yet sure they liked. Lyra sat at her small table, with her journal open in front of her, and listened to the halting sound drifting up from below, and found it oddly comforting. All that earnest effort towards something not yet mastered. She had been avoiding the journal for almost a month. She had been writing in it, short, practical entries about work and practical matters. But she had been very deliberately not writing about the things that were actually taking up space inside her. She was a person who believed in honesty, but she had discovered that there was a specific kind of honesty that required more stillness than she had possessed until now. The kind of honesty that meant sitting down with yourself and writing the truth about things you would rather not see in black ink. She was still enough now. She picked up her pen. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping. She wrote about the day she had walked into Kaylin's office for the first time and how certain she had felt. That specific confidence of a young woman who has a solution in her hands and believes the solution will be welcomed. It had been welcomed. That was the part that she had to be accurate about. He had not taken advantage of her. He had not manipulated her into staying or misrepresented what she was to him. He had genuinely valued her work. He had genuinely cared about her, in whatever way he was capable of caring about people. The problem was not that he had used her. The problem was more complicated and more painful than that. She wrote it out carefully, because she believed in being careful with complex things. The problem was that she had done what many women did when they loved someone. She had made his life the container for her own. She had told herself it was because she cared, because she was dedicated, because the work was important and she was the right person to do it. All of that was true. But underneath all of it was something simpler and less noble, which was that caring for his needs had felt safer than deciding what her own needs were and pursuing them. She stopped writing for a moment and looked at what she had just put down. The music lesson below had moved to a piece she almost recognized. Something slow and tentative, the bow pressed carefully on the strings. She had made herself small in 1,000 careful ways. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the accumulation of small decisions. She had stopped mentioning her own preferences when they conflicted with what was convenient. She had stopped pursuing the friendships she had once had because they required time she was always giving to something else. She had stopped reading for pleasure because reading felt indulgent when there was always something more useful to be done. She had stopped sleeping. She had stopped eating properly. She had reorganized every part of her life around the shape of his needs, until there was almost nothing left that was purely, recognizably hers. And then when he had chosen someone else, she had stood in that room and said, "I understand," in a clear, steady voice, as though the only thing required of her in that moment was to be gracious. She pressed her pen against the page. She had been so proud of that composure. Even now, a part of her was proud of it. But she made herself look at it directly and ask honestly, was the composure real, or had it simply been the most refined version of what she had always done, which was to suppress what she actually felt, in favor of whatever presentation seemed most appropriate for the situation? She thought it had been both. She thought she genuinely had a great capacity for composure. It was a real thing in her character, not an act. But she also thought that she had spent so many years prioritizing presentation over feeling, that by the time the worst thing happened, the priority had become automatic, and she had been composed before she had even had the chance to decide whether composure was what she wanted. She wrote, "I made myself easy to overlook. I thought that being capable and quiet, and always available, meant I would be valued. I did not understand, until too late, that people value what they have to reach for. Not because they are shallow, but because ease invites taking for granted. I was always there. I was always ready. I never let him see what it cost me, and because he never saw the cost, He never had to account for it. She put the pen down and read that back. She thought it was probably the truest thing she had ever written. It was also, she noticed, entirely without blame directed at anyone but herself, which was maybe not entirely fair, but she was not in the business of fairness tonight. She was in the business of accuracy. What she had done, she had done. He had made his choice, and it was a choice she should have seen coming if she had been willing to look. But she had not wanted to look. Looking would have required her to confront what she suspected, and confronting it would have required her to either leave or to ask for something directly, and she had been afraid of both. Leaving meant losing him. Asking directly meant learning that she was not what he would choose. She had chosen the third option, which was to stay and hope and work and give more. And that option had cost her everything. She picked the pen back up. She wrote, "I will not do this again. Not the loving. I can love again, I think. But the self-erasure. The quiet shrinking. The assumption that if I am useful enough, and present enough, and undemanding enough, love will come as a reward. That is not how love works. That is a transaction, dressed up as devotion, and it benefits only one person." She wrote for another hour after that. She wrote about her mother, who had done the same thing her whole life, and had been exhausted by it, and had passed the exhaustion down to Lyra without meaning to. She wrote about the moment on the palace terrace, when she had understood that she was leaving, and how she had been surprised by the relief in it. She wrote about this room and the print house, and Edmund and Clara's daughters, and the music lesson she could still faintly hear winding down below. She wrote, "I am beginning to understand that the life I had was not the life I would have chosen. It was the life I fell into because it was the first place where I felt necessary. And necessary is not the same as wanted. I want to be wanted. I want someone to choose me the way I chose him. Daily, clearly, without a backup plan." The house was quiet, in the way it got in the evenings when the girls had been put to bed, and Clara had settled into her chair downstairs with her mending. Lyra sat at her small table for a while longer without moving, letting the quiet settle around her. She felt, unexpectedly, something like peace. Not happiness. She was too clear-eyed to mistake this feeling for happiness, but something underneath happiness, something that happiness was built on when it was real. She felt that she knew herself a little better than she had this morning. She felt that the woman in the mirror would look back at her more steadily tomorrow. She blew out the candle, lay down on the narrow bed, and slept without dreams. In the morning she woke before the light was full and lay on her back, and looked at the ceiling, and thought about the day ahead. There was work to do at the print house. Edmund had mentioned yesterday that a significant new client was coming in, a publisher from the northern city who wanted to discuss a contract for a long series of educational books for children. Edmund had asked if she would sit in on the meeting, and she had said yes. She got up. She washed her face and dressed and combed her hair. She went downstairs and had breakfast with Clara and the girls, who were in good morning spirits, and told her at length about the music lesson the night before, and which pieces they had practiced, and which ones were still giving them trouble. Lyra listened, and asked questions, and laughed at the right moments, and she walked to the print house in the early morning light, feeling something that she chose, carefully and deliberately, to call hope. Not hope for anything specific, just hope in general, the way you carry it when you are beginning to believe again that the future might contain things you cannot yet see. She had been very focused on what was behind her for the past weeks, which was necessary and right, but this morning, she walked and looked ahead at the street in front of her, at the morning opening around her, at the specific quality of light that comes just after sunrise, when everything is still a little quiet. She thought, "I do not know what is coming." And she thought, for the first time in a long time, that is not something I need to fear. She pushed open the door of the print house. It smelled of ink and paper and old wood and possibility. Edmund was already at his desk. He looked up and said good morning in his practical way. She said good morning back and went to her own desk and settled in. There was work to do. She started. The northern publisher arrived at mid-morning. His name was Philip Crane, and he was a large, loud man with an impressive collection of opinions about the future of printed books, and almost no patience for being disagreed with. He sat across the table from Edmund in the print house's small front room, and began speaking at considerable length about what he wanted, and what he expected, and how he had done business with 3 other printers in the city, before finding this establishment, and why none of them had met his standards. Edmund listened with the expression of a man who had sat across from difficult people many times and found them manageable. He asked thoughtful questions at the right moments and let Philip Crane feel that he was being heard, which was usually all that men of that particular type required. Lyra sat to one side with a notebook, taking notes and saying very little. She had learned years ago that this was frequently the most powerful position in a room, the quiet one in the corner with the pen, who everyone underestimated, and who was therefore free to observe everything without anyone performing for her benefit. Philip Crane wanted a series of 14 books for children, on subjects ranging from the natural world to geography to the basics of commerce. He had the manuscripts already written. He wanted them printed, bound, and distributed to schools in 3 provinces within 18 months. He quoted a price that was too low by approximately 40%. Edmund heard the price and said nothing immediately. He looked at the papers on the table in front of him in a considered way. Lyra looked at her notebook and wrote several figures. Then she tore the page out, folded it, and slid it across the table to Edmund. She did not look up. Edmund unfolded the paper, read it, folded it again. He looked at Philip Crane and quoted a different number. He explained very precisely, in 4 sentences, why that number was accurate, and why the original offer, while understandable from the client's perspective, would result in compromised quality at every stage of the production process, which would ultimately reflect poorly on Philip Crane's publishing reputation. Philip Crane looked startled. He was not used to being countered this calmly. He looked at Lyra, who was still looking at her notebook. He looked back at Edmund. He said he would need to think about it. Edmund said of course, and there was no urgency, but the production schedule for the coming year was filling quickly, and they would need to confirm within 2 weeks if this partnership was to work. Philip Crane left 40 minutes later. He did not commit immediately, but he shook hands more firmly than he had arrived, and he looked, Lyra thought, like a man who had met something he had not expected. Edmund sat back in his chair after the door closed and said, without looking at her directly, "That was a useful piece of paper." She said she had done a quick calculation on the binding costs per volume, times 14 titles, plus the distribution logistics. She said the number he had asked for was still within the range that would make the contract worthwhile for the press. He said he was aware of that, which was why he had used it. They sat for a moment, in the quiet of the print house, the machines idle at midday, the smell of ink thick and pleasant. He said, "I should probably pay you more." She said, "Yes, you probably should." He made a sound that might have been a laugh or might simply have been acknowledgement. He said he would adjust things starting next week. She thanked him and went back to her desk. Walking home that evening, she felt the day sitting in her lightly, not as a burden but as something with a little weight in the good sense, the weight of work that had mattered, of capability that had been used and seen, not performed, not offered in the hope of something in return. Simply used, as a craftsperson uses a tool they know well, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who is doing what they are good at. She stopped at the market on the way home and bought a small bunch of flowers, yellow ones, the kind she had always liked, because they were there, and they were pretty, and she wanted them. She had not bought herself flowers in years. She had not done many small things purely because she wanted them in years. She had forgotten that this was possible, that you could simply want something small and have it, without that want being in service of something or someone else. She put the flowers in a cup of water on her table and looked at them for a moment before she sat down to write. She wrote, "Today I was competent, and I was seen, and I asked for more, and it was given. I brought flowers home because I wanted them. I am starting to understand that these 2 things are the same thing." She was not sure exactly what she meant by that, but she wrote it down, because writing was how she figured out what she meant, and she thought she would understand it later if she looked at it enough. She closed the journal. She looked at the yellow flowers in the cup on her table. Outside, the evening light was going soft over the rooftops. She sat quietly. She breathed. She let herself be exactly where she was, without wishing it were somewhere else, without measuring it against something she had lost. She was still here, she was still herself, and slowly, one day at a time, she was learning what that actually meant. The illness came in the winter. It started as most illnesses do, quietly, with small things that did not seem significant. A cough that arrived in November and did not leave. A tiredness that was deeper than her usual tiredness, and that sleep did not fully relieve. She told herself it was the change of seasons. told herself it was the adjustment of her body to a new way of living after years of running on very little rest. She kept working. She kept walking home in the cold evening air and eating at Clara's table and writing in her journal by candlelight. By December, the cough had become something that woke her in the night. By January, she was losing weight she did not have to lose. Clara, who noticed things, began leaving extra food on the table without comment, and looking at Lyra in the mornings with a careful expression that she tried to make unobtrusive. Lyra went to see a doctor in the second week of January. The doctor was a quiet, serious woman named Helen, who had a practice on the ground floor of a tall house near the square. She examined Lyra for a long time without saying much, and then she said, in the careful way that doctors have when they are being accurate and kind simultaneously, that the lungs were involved. She said it was manageable with rest and the right treatment, but that rest was the operative word. Real rest, prolonged rest, the kind that Lyra had not managed in years. Lyra said she understood. She walked back to Clara's house in the cold January light and sat on her bed and looked at the yellow flowers she kept replacing on her table and thought about what the doctor had said. She thought about it for a long time. She was not afraid, exactly. She was something more complicated than afraid. She was sitting with the knowledge that her body, which she had run hard and fed poorly and pushed past its signals for years, because there had always been something more important than what her body needed, had reached the end of its tolerance. It was not a punishment. She did not think of it as punishment. It was consequence, and it was honest, and in some strange way it was almost a relief to be confronted by something she could not simply manage her way through. She told Edmund the next morning that she would need to reduce her hours while she recovered. She said it plainly, without apology, which was the new way she had been learning to say difficult things. Edmund looked at her for a moment with those quietly attentive eyes and said he was sorry to hear it and that the work would be there when she was ready. He said her desk would wait. She thanked him and went home. She rested. It was the hardest thing she had done in years, and also in some ways the simplest. She stayed in her room. She slept a great deal. Clara brought soup without being asked, and her youngest daughter, a girl of 8 named Bess, came upstairs sometimes in the afternoons to sit near Lyra's bed and tell her about her day in the meandering, specific way that children tell stories, full of details that went nowhere and digressions that were more interesting than the main point. Lyra listened and asked questions and found, unexpectedly, that this was its own kind of medicine. She wrote in her journal every day, not the short practical entries she had been writing, but the long, honest ones she had returned to in the autumn. She had more time for them now, and more stillness, and she found herself going to places in her writing that she had been circling without entering. She wrote about her mother again. Her mother had been a practical, capable woman, who had worn herself down managing a household with very little money, and 3 children, and a husband who was well-meaning but unreliable, and who had died at 52 of a tiredness that the doctors had called various things, without quite capturing what it was. Lyra had been 19 when her mother died. She had sat by the bed in the last days and held her hand and thought that she would never let herself arrive at that particular kind of tired. She had been wrong about that. She had arrived at it by 27, which was, she thought, the younger of the 2 of them. She wrote, I learned from watching her that love means giving yourself until there is nothing left. I watched her do it, and I thought it was beautiful, and I thought it was devotion, and I wanted to be like her in that way. I did not understand until now that what I was watching was not devotion. It was depletion, and depletion is not love. It is what happens when love has no boundary. She put the pen down and looked at the words. She thought about Kalen. She thought about him less often now than she had in the first weeks, but she still thought about him, because you do not stop thinking about someone who occupied the center of your life for 6 years simply because you have left. The thoughts had changed character, though. In the beginning, they had been saturated with pain, sharp, specific, returning to the same moments again and again, like a tongue going to a sore tooth. Now they were more considered, more like looking at an old photograph than looking at an open wound. She thought about what he was doing now. The betrothal would be official. Selene would be at court, would be in the rooms Lyra had moved through every day for years. There would be a wedding eventually, a significant one, a state occasion, the kind that Lyra would have organized. She wondered who would organize it, she thought, with a distant flicker of dark humor, that they would discover it was harder than they had expected. She did not feel vindictive about this. She noted the dark humor and let it pass. What she felt, when she sat with it carefully, was something closer to sadness for the younger version of herself. The 21-year-old walking into that office for the first time, so bright and certain, so full of the kind of energy that comes from believing your gifts will be met with their proper value. That young woman had not deserved what happened to her. She had deserved better, and the fact that better had not come was not evidence of her worth. It was only evidence of circumstances. The winter deepened. She recovered slowly, in the way of things that are being properly tended to for the first time. She began sitting up for longer periods. She began taking short walks, just to the end of the street and back, watching her breath cloud in the cold air, watching the city exist in its busy, ordinary way around her. She thought, on one of these walks, that the city was the same whether she was in it or not. The market ran. The mill turned. The print house produced its documents and pamphlets and the occasional book. The bells rang from the court tower as they always had, marking time that moved at its own pace regardless of who was paying attention. She thought, I have been behaving as though I were necessary to something that will continue without me. And she thought, everything will continue without me. That is not a tragic thought. That is the most freeing thought there is. She walked back to Clara's house slowly, her breath visible in the air, her hands in her coat pockets. Bess was standing at the window when she came up the path and waved energetically when she saw her, and Lyra waved back, and the small warm weight of that, being seen and waved at by a child who was simply happy to see her, landed in her chest in a way that surprised her. She was being cared for, not because she had organized something or solved something or made herself indispensable to something, just because she was here, and she was a person, and the people around her had decided she mattered. She had not known how to receive this at first. She had kept trying to be useful, kept offering to help with things, kept feeling the anxious pull of not doing enough. Gradually, over these weeks, she had been practicing something different. She had been practicing simply being present, sitting at the table, listening to Bess's stories, thanking Clara honestly when she brought soup, not deflecting the kindness with busyness. It was harder than it sounded. It required a kind of openness that felt vulnerable, because receiving care without immediately reciprocating it required trusting that you were worth caring for, even when you were not doing anything in particular. She was learning that she was. There were still hard nights, nights when the grief came back in full, when the longing for what had been came over her like a tide she could not reason her way out of. She had learned to let those nights happen without fighting them, and without catastrophizing them. The grief was real. It deserved its room. What she would not do anymore was let it convince her that the grief was permanent evidence of something true about her value. She got better. By March, the cough had mostly gone, and her sleep was longer, and she was eating properly, and the doctor said the lungs sounded cleaner. Lyra went back to the print house on a bright morning in late March, with the feeling that she was returning to something rather than returning to nothing, which was a distinction she would not have been able to make 6 months ago. Edmund looked up when she came in and said, "The desk has been waiting." She sat down at it. The stack of work was already organized. He had done that himself, she noted, sorted by urgency in a way that showed he had learned from watching her, which she found unexpectedly moving. She picked up the first document and began to read. The world was the same as she had left it. The ink smelled the same. The light came through the window at the same angle. The machinery in the back room made the same low, rhythmic noise. But she was not the same. She was quieter and lighter, and she understood in a new way that the life she was living was one she had made herself, without permission from anyone, without anyone to tell her it was the right one, and that this was the most important thing she had ever done. She worked steadily through the morning. She did not think about the palace. She did not think about Kaelin. She thought about the document in front of her, and the problem it presented, and how she intended to solve it. This was enough. This was, finally, genuinely enough. The thing about healing is that it is never complete in the way you expect it to be. Lyra had imagined, in those dark January nights, that there would be a clear moment, a morning she would wake up and feel fully restored, fully herself again, the past laid cleanly to rest, and the future open in front of her like a door standing wide. It did not happen that way. It happened the way spring happens, slowly, in accumulation, in small things that are each too minor to point to but that together shift the quality of everything. She began to make friends again. It happened without her meaning it to, which was perhaps how it had always worked before she had withdrawn so completely into Kaylin's world. Edmund had a daughter who was close to Lyra's age, a woman named Frances who worked as a bookbinder, and who came into the print house on Thursdays to collect the week's finished work. Frances was direct and funny, and had strong opinions about which types of thread were appropriate for which binding styles, and one Thursday she suggested they have lunch at the bakery 2 streets over, and Lyra said yes. They had lunch. Then they had lunch the following Thursday, and the one after that, and gradually a friendship formed out of these lunches. A real one. Not the polite semi-friendship that Lyra had maintained at court with people she worked alongside, but never truly open to. Frances asked her once, after several months, what she had done before the print house. Lyra said she had worked in administration for a large institution. Frances asked which one, and Lyra said she would rather not say. Frances nodded and said that was fine, and asked what she thought of the new bakery rolls, which were slightly smaller than the old ones. This was what a good friend did, Lyra thought. A good friend did not push at the doors you preferred to keep shut. A good friend made room for what you were not ready to say, and moved on to something warmer. She told Frances more, eventually. Not everything. Not the full shape of what Kaylin had been to her. Not the depth of what she had given, or what it had cost. But enough. Enough to be known by. Enough that Frances could hear a certain kind of thing in Lyra's voice when Kaylin's name came up, and understand without being told that it was still a place that required care. Frances had her own history of loving someone who had not loved her properly in return. She told Lyra about it matter-of-factly, over a 3rd cup of tea on a rainy Thursday, and Lyra listened with the full attention she had trained herself to give things that mattered, and felt the specific comfort of recognizing yourself in someone else's story. The world, it turned out, was full of women who had loved too well and been loved too carelessly. She had known this abstractly. She knew it personally now. She wrote in her journal, "I have been alone for a long time, but I have not been lonely lately. I think the difference is that before I was surrounded by people and empty in a way I kept trying to fill by being useful. Now I have fewer people around me, but the ones I have actually see me. And that is worth more than a palace full of people who know your name and not your face." She put the pen down and looked at that sentence for a moment. Then she added, "I think I am becoming the person I was always supposed to be. I just had to stop trying to become her for someone else." Spring came fully. The city warmed, and the windows opened, and the market smells changed to something fresher. Lyra walked her usual evening routes, and noticed the change in the air, and felt it as something personal. The kind of warmth that arrives when your body has been cold for a long time, and finally the temperature lifts to where it should be. She was stronger. Her lungs were clear. Her face in the mirror had a steadiness to it now that had not been there before. She was not the same as she had been at 21. Brighter and more brittle, more certain and less rooted, but she thought she was something better than she had been. She was a person who had been through a great deal, and had not flinched at looking at it honestly. And that gave her a kind of groundedness that bright certainty never had. One morning in April, Philip Crane sent word to the print house that he had decided to sign the contract. 14 books, the number Edmund had named, the production schedule Lyra had outlined in a second set of notes she had prepared after the original meeting. She was not sure why she felt a small, quiet satisfaction at this that was separate from its practical significance, and then she understood. It was the satisfaction of work that was fully her own. Not in service of anyone else's ambition, just good work, done well, recognized. Edmund gave her a modest bonus that week without making a production of it. He left an envelope on her desk with a note that said, "For good work." She put it in her coat pocket and walked home, and stopped at the flower stall and bought yellow ones again. She put them in the cup on her table. She stood and looked at them for a moment. She thought, "I am here. I am well. I am mine." She sat down and opened her journal to a new page and began to write. A year passed, and then another. The city became familiar in the way that only happens when you have lived somewhere long enough to stop seeing it and start simply inhabiting it. Lyra knew which bakery was best at which hour, and which streets were quieter in the mornings, and which days the flower seller had the freshest stock. She knew Clara's daughters by their individual rhythms. Bess, who was loud and enthusiastic in the mornings, Nell, who needed silence before breakfast, and the eldest, Hattie, who woke early, and could be found already at the kitchen table with a book before anyone else came down. She had become part of the texture of this household without planning to. which was different from the way she had become part of things at the palace. At the palace, she had made herself indispensable. Here she had simply stayed, and been present, and let the intimacy form at its own pace, and what had grown was something quieter and more durable. Edmund had given her a formal position. The word office manager would not have been wrong, though she and Edmund never used that phrase, and the print house had grown considerably in the 2 years she had been there. Philip Crane's book series had been a success, and on the back of it, 2 other educational publishers had found their way to Edmund's door. She had managed both contracts and had begun taking on the more complex negotiations herself, which Edmund allowed because he had the wisdom to recognize when someone was better at something than he was, and to step aside graciously. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The difference was that now the goodness was for something she had chosen, in a life she had chosen, and the results landed with a weight and meaning that the same competence had never had when she was giving it to someone else's purposes. Frances had become her closest friend. They had lunch every Thursday, and sometimes on Saturday mornings too, and they had acquired the kind of friendship where you could say almost anything, because you had already said enough difficult things, that the silences between you had a different quality than with other people. Frances had a way of asking questions that opened things rather than closing them, and Lyra, who had spent years in a world where questions were usually a form of navigation rather than genuine inquiry, found this genuinely revolutionary. She had started sleeping well. This was something she still noticed, because for so long she had woken in the night with her mind already working, already composing letters or reviewing lists or running through the day's tasks before the sky had turned light. Now she woke with the morning, and lay for a few minutes in the quiet of her room, a different room now, a slightly larger one on the same floor, with a window that looked over the front garden instead of the back, and let herself come to the day slowly. She was not unhappy. She wanted to be precise about this, because she had sometimes in the past confused the absence of acute pain with happiness, and they were not the same thing. She was genuinely, quietly, daily content, in a way she had not been since she was very young, before she had learned to organize herself around other people's needs. She still thought about Kaylin sometimes, less than she had in the first year, but honestly, she had heard things, not because she sought them out, but because the city was not entirely disconnected from the palace, and news moved. She had heard that the wedding had taken place, a large and formal affair in the autumn of the first year. She had heard that Selene was settled at court, and was described in the language of public discourse as gracious and suitable. She had heard nothing that surprised her, which was perhaps its own kind of confirmation. She did not hate him. She had worked her way through the anger carefully and thoroughly in her journal, and had come out the other side of it, feeling something more nuanced, which was the particular kind of sadness you feel for things that were real and beautiful in some ways, and wrong in others, and that could not be made to be only one or the other in memory. He had been genuinely important to her. That did not require revision. What required revision was the story she had told herself about what his importance meant, that because she loved him and he valued her, and because they had spent years in close proximity to a kind of intimacy, she had believed they were building toward something. The revising was done now. The grief was not gone, but it had become a quiet thing, rather than a loud one, a weight she carried in a way that no longer slowed her steps. She was 29 now. She had started thinking, carefully and without urgency, about what she wanted. Not what was needed or what was practical or what she could offer, but what she specifically wanted for the next chapter of her life. This was new. She had spent so long operating in service of someone else's vision that she had barely developed a vocabulary for her own wants. She was building it now, word by word. She wanted work that used the full extent of what she was capable of. She was doing that. She wanted genuine friendship. She had that. She wanted a place that felt like home. She was slowly finding that too, in this rented room, in this house with these people, in this small and ordinary city life. She wanted, eventually, to love again. She was honest about that. She was not in a hurry, and she was not looking, and she had the hard-won clarity to know that any love she entered now would be from a different position than the one she had occupied at 21, not from the position of someone who needed to be useful to be kept, but from the position of someone who knew her own value and would require that it be recognized. She wrote this in her journal one evening in the second spring, and then looked at it for a moment. She had been afraid to write it down, afraid it would sound like a demand or a contract rather than a desire. But it did not look like that on the page. It looked like simply knowing yourself. She went on working, one day at a time. It was in the third year that the letter arrived. She did not recognize the handwriting on the envelope. She turned it over and looked at it for a moment before opening it. That specific hesitation that comes with unfamiliar correspondence. The return was an address in the northern part of the city, a neighborhood she knew only slightly, the district where some of the merchant families had their larger houses. She opened it at her desk during her morning work hour. The letter was from a woman named Agnes, who described herself as the administrator of a newly formed organization called the Northern Education Society, which was a group of benefactors who had come together to fund schools for children in the provinces where educational resources were limited. Agnes wrote that she had been given Lyra's name by Philip Crane, who had described her as the most capable person he had encountered in 10 years of the publishing business. Agnes asked if Lyra would be willing to come and speak with them about a potential role. Not a small role, but the kind of leadership position that the society needed in order to function effectively. Lyra read the letter twice. She sat with it for a moment. She thought about the print house, where she had made something she was proud of, and where Edmund trusted her, and where her work had real meaning. She thought about what Agnes had described, which was larger than anything she had done, and which was in service of a purpose she found herself immediately and viscerally caring about, because she had grown up in a family where money was uncertain, and education had been the thing that changed the trajectory of possibility. She wrote back that afternoon. She said she would be pleased to come and speak with them. The meeting was the following Thursday, which meant she could not have lunch with Francis, which she sent a note about. Francis wrote back immediately, and said that if the meeting was what Lyra thought it might be, she absolutely should go, and that the lunch could wait. She went to the meeting in the Northern District in her best coat, which was good but not showy, with her notebook and a pen, and the particular quality of attention she gave to things that might become important. The Northern Education Society occupied the ground floor of a tall house on a quiet street. Agnes was a woman of about 50, with clear eyes, and the unhurried manner of someone who had made peace with how much there was to do by deciding to do it methodically. She introduced Lyra to 3 of the society's founding members, who were all clearly accomplished people who asked intelligent questions and actually listened to the answers. They talked for 2 hours. Lyra spoke about her experience managing complex logistics, about the Crane contract, about what she had learned running the print house, and about what she believed a properly run administration could do for an organization of this kind. She also spoke, at one point, about why this particular work mattered to her. She did not do this in an elaborate way. She said it simply and clearly, in 2 sentences, and then she stopped speaking and let the 2 sentences stand. One of the founding members, a man named George, looked at her for a moment after she said this and said that in his experience, people who understood why something mattered were considerably more effective than people who only understood how it worked. She thanked him. Walking home that evening, she knew that she wanted this. Not the way she had wanted things when she was operating from need, not from the anxious place of wanting to be indispensable to something, from a different place altogether. From the place where wanting and purpose and genuine care for something outside yourself came together and made a direction. She sat down that evening and wrote in her journal for a long time. She wrote, "I think the next part of my life is beginning. Not in the way life begins when you are young and afraid and running on hope and uncertainty, but in the way it begins when you have been through enough to know what you are for." She closed the journal. The yellow flowers were on the table. The evening light was coming through the window in the particular way it did at this hour, slanted and warm. She thought, "I am ready." The Northern Education Society offered her the position the following week. The offer was formal and specific. Director of Operations, responsible for the administrative and logistical management of the Society's school founding work across 3 provinces. The salary was more than she had earned at the print house, which was itself more than she had ever been formally paid at the palace, a fact that sat with a quiet irony she chose not to dwell on. The work would be significant, and the responsibility would be real, which was what she wanted. She thought about it for exactly 2 days. Then she said yes. She told Edmund first. She sat across his desk from him in the morning light of the print house and told him what had happened, and he listened with the expression that she had learned to read as genuine, rather than polished, the look he had when something was real to him. He said he was not surprised. She asked what he meant. He said, "From the beginning, I could tell that this place was not your ceiling. I was glad to have you for as long as I had you. But I would have been a poor sort of person if I tried to keep you from something larger. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "You have been one of the best things about the past 3 years." He said, "The work has been good. And that is usually what I can say about anything." They shook hands. She spent her last 2 weeks at the print house, training a young man named Colin, who had recently come to the city from a northern town, and who had a good mind for numbers, and a genuine interest in the mechanics of how a print house worked. She organized her desk, which she had inherited in mild disorder, and was leaving in perfect order, and she wrote Colin 3 pages of notes about the production schedule, the client relationships, and the particular preferences and sensitivities of each regular client. She left on a Friday afternoon. Edmund walked her to the door. He said, "Come back when you want good tea." The print house had always had good tea, which was one of the things she had liked best about it. She said she would. She started at the Northern Education Society the following Monday. The work was everything she had hoped it would be, and several things she had not anticipated. The society was doing genuinely important work, but it had been running largely on goodwill and the personal organization skills of Agnes, who was brilliant at understanding people and hopeless at filing systems. On her first day, Lyra found a correspondence backlog that went back 8 months, a budget tracking sheet that bore no relationship to the actual expenditures, and 3 separate school projects that were at different stages of development, with no central record of where each one stood. She made a list. She always made a list. She worked through it systematically over the following weeks, building systems that were clear and maintainable, establishing communication protocols with the schools in the provinces, getting the budget organized, and creating a central record of every project with its current status and the next required action. Agnes watched this with the combination of relief and slightly stunned gratitude that people display when someone solves a problem they have been drowning in for a long time. The founding members of the society were intelligent people who cared deeply about the work, and Lyra found them easy to work with in the specific way that makes intelligent, caring people easy. They listened, they asked useful questions, and they did not require her to manage their egos before she could get to the substance of things. Working with people who were focused on something outside themselves was, she found, profoundly different from working in a world where everything circled back to the status and needs of a single person at the center. She thought about that sometimes. About how much of her energy at the palace had gone not toward the work itself, but toward the navigation of one person's inner world, what Kaylin needed, what Kaylin felt, what Kaylin might think about a given situation. The work had always been complicated by this secondary layer of emotional labor that she had not even fully recognized she was doing, because it had become so automatic. Here, the work was simply the work. Frances came to her new office one Thursday to have lunch, which they brought in and ate at the table in the back room. Frances looked around at the organized shelves and the clear desk and the wall where Lyra had pinned a map of the 3 provinces with the school locations marked, and she said, "Yes, this is exactly right." Lyra said, "It feels like it fits." Frances said, "Some things are supposed to fit. That is not a small thing." They had lunch and talked about the work and about other things. And after Frances had gone, Lyra sat at her desk for a moment in the afternoon quiet and thought about that. Some things are supposed to fit. She was 30 years old. She had been in this city for 3 years. She had built a life here that was genuinely her own, that fit her, that asked for what she had, and gave her something real in return. It was not the life she had imagined when she was 21. She had not imagined any of this at 21. She had imagined a future that centered on someone else. The future she had instead was centered on herself, and it turned out to be considerably better. She picked up her pen and went back to work. In the evenings she walked through the city and watched the light change over the rooftops and felt the specific pleasure of a person who knows where they are. Not in the geographical sense only, though she knew this city now, as she had once known the palace, in its small details and its textures, but in the deeper sense. She knew where she was in herself. She knew what she valued, and what she would not give up, and what she required from the people around her, and what she offered in return. She was not guarded. She did not want to become guarded. Guardedness was its own kind of prison, and she had spent enough time in prisons she had not recognized as such. She was simply awake. She was simply someone who had learned, the hard way, and the only way you actually learn things that matter, who she was. Spring came again. the fourth spring since she had walked out of the palace with one bag. She bought yellow flowers and put them on her desk at the society, where Agnes looked at them and said, "Those are cheerful." Lyra said, "Yes, I find they help." Agnes said she would have to remember that, and went back to her own work. Lyra looked at the flowers for a moment. She thought about the first cup of flowers she had bought, in the flat early days of her new life, how new and slightly uncertain even that small act had felt, the act of wanting something small and simply having it. She thought about how far she had come from the person who had needed to make herself useful before she could feel she deserved to exist in a space. She was still sometimes the person who moved too quickly to help, who offered too readily, who had to consciously remind herself to receive as well as give. Probably she would always be a little like that. It was in her character, and her character was not a thing to be eliminated, but to be understood and worked with. But she was no longer the person who gave herself entirely away. She knew the value of what she had now. She would not trade it for anyone who could not meet it. She went on with her work, steadily and with purpose, building something she was proud of, in a life she had made herself. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. The man appeared in late September, in the way that things you were not expecting tend to appear, without warning, in the middle of an ordinary moment. Lyra was walking back from a meeting with one of the provincial school coordinators, a late afternoon meeting that had run long, and the city was in that particular September light that turns everything slightly golden just before the evening comes in. She was thinking about the school in the eastern province, which needed a new building before the winter rains arrived, and she was composing the letter she would write to the regional building authority in her head as she walked, running through the key arguments in sequence. She turned a corner and nearly walked into a man standing at the edge of the street. She stepped back and said, "Excuse me," without looking up properly. He said the same. She started to move around him. Then he said her name. She stopped. She turned and looked at him, and in the first second she did not understand what she was seeing, because the mind does not always process the thing it is least prepared for. He was tall and lean and tired-looking, wearing travel clothes that were well-made but dusty, and he was watching her with an expression that was both certain and unsure at the same time, the way someone looks when they have prepared for this moment at length, but the reality of it has caught them off guard. It was Kaylin. She stood very still. He said her name again. He said, "I have been looking for you." She noticed, from a distant observing place inside herself, several things at once. She noticed that her hands had gone cold. She noticed that her heartbeat had changed in a way she felt in her throat. She noticed that the composure she had spent years building was being tested right now, in a way it had never been tested in the print house, or the society, or anywhere in the life she had built, because those places had been new terrain, and this person was the original landscape. She said, "I see that." Her voice came out steady. She was glad about that. She looked at him. He looked older than she remembered. Not dramatically. He was still a young man, not yet 35. But there was a worn quality to him that had not been there before. Lines around his eyes that came from something more than age. The particular look of a person who has been living in difficulty for a while and has stopped being surprised by it. She said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "Can we speak somewhere quiet?" She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the places she was supposed to be that evening, the things she had planned to do, the letter she had been composing in her head. She thought about how easy it would be to say no. She thought about how 3 years ago she would not have said no, would not have been capable of saying no, and what that had cost her. She said, "There is a tea house at the end of this street, 30 minutes. That is what I can offer." He said, "Thank you." They walked to the tea house without talking. She chose a table at the back, where the noise of the other patrons provided a kind of privacy. She ordered tea for both of them, without asking, because she knew how he took it, which was a small and useless knowledge she had apparently been carrying for 3 years without noticing. He sat across from her. He looked at her with the direct way she remembered. One of the things she had always valued in him was that he did not look away from things, that he faced what was in front of him. He said, "I know I do not have the right to come here." She said, "And yet here you are." He said, "I know. I have been trying to decide for a long time whether to come or not. I am not sure I decided correctly. I understand if you would rather I had not." She said, "Say what you came to say." He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up and said, The kingdom is in difficulty. It has been in difficulty for the past year. There are things happening politically in the north that I am not handling well, and I know I am not handling them well, and I find I cannot approach them with any clarity, because I am not thinking clearly, and I have not been for some time. She waited. He said, I ended my betrothal to Selene 7 months ago. It was a mutual agreement. She is well, and I bear her no ill will. But the marriage did not. We were not the right match, and she knew it, and I knew it, and we decided together to be honest about that, before the situation became worse. She heard this, and felt several things simultaneously, none of which she showed on her face. She picked up her teacup and drank from it, partly to have something to do with her hands. She said, I am sorry to hear that. I imagine it was difficult for everyone. He said, yes, I am sorry for it too, but that is not why I came. She said, why did you come? He was quiet for a moment. She watched him in the way she had always watched him, noting the stillness that came before something that cost him. He said, I came because there has not been a day in 3 years when I have not thought about you, not a single one, and I have tried to find ways to make that not true, and I have been entirely unable to. I came because you left, and you were right to leave, and I have spent 3 years understanding more fully how right you were, and I thought that being honest with you was something I owed you, regardless of what you do with it. I am not here to ask you to come back. I do not have the right to ask that. I am here because you deserve to hear this from me, and you never did. She looked at him. She thought about 21-year-old Lyra, who had walked into his office with files under her arm, and a plan, and such confidence. She thought about the version of herself who had stood in his war chamber 3 years ago and said, I understand, in a clear voice, and how enormous that moment had been in her life, how much of the person she had become had been built in response to it. She said, I appreciate you saying that. He watched her. She said, I need you to understand something. What you have said matters to me. I am glad you said it, but I am not the same person you knew. I am not the woman who organized your kingdom and wrote your letters and traveled north on your behalf and made herself smaller every year because she was afraid of what it would mean to take up more space. That person is gone, not because she was wrong to exist, but because she needed to grow into something else. He said, I know, I can see that. She said, I am not sure you can. Not fully. Not yet. What you see right now is the outside of a great deal of work that you did not witness and cannot fully imagine. He said, I believe you. She said, I hope so. They sat with the silence between them for a moment. Outside the tea house, the evening had come in properly now, the September dark descending with its early cool, the streetlights coming on. Inside, the murmur of other conversations continued around them. He looked at her. He said, I am not asking for anything. I want to be clear about that. I came to say what I came to say, and I have said it, and I will go now if you would like me to. She looked at him. She thought about the person she had been when she loved him, and the person she was now. She thought about what it had cost her to become this person, and what it would cost her now to make a careless decision, a decision from the old patterns, from the girl who had always found it easier to give than to guard. She said, I am not going to give you an answer today about anything. I am not going to tell you to stay or to go or to come back or not to. What I am going to tell you is this. I have a life here. It is a good life. It is the best life I have had. I am not going to trade any part of it for anything that is not worth the same or more. He said, I understand. She said, I am not sure you do yet, but perhaps you will. She stood up. She put money on the table for the tea. She looked at him once more, this person she had once known so completely, and who had become in 3 years a strange combination of familiar and foreign. She said, I am going home now. He stood also. He said, Thank you for seeing me. She nodded. She walked to the door of the tea house, and through it, and out into the September evening, and she did not look back, and she walked the rest of the way home, at a steady pace, with her hands in her coat pockets, breathing the cool autumn air. She sat on her bed when she got home, and let herself feel everything she was feeling, which was considerable. She did not cry. She did not feel like crying. She felt like someone who had just encountered an earthquake that turned out to be much smaller than anticipated, still a tremor, still something that shifted the ground, but manageable. She was still standing. She opened her journal. She wrote for an hour, getting it all down. What he had said, what she had said, what she had felt, what she had noticed in herself. She wrote it all as accurately as she could, because accuracy was how she trusted herself. At the end she wrote, "I do not know what happens next, but I know that I decided from myself today, not from fear or habit, and that is the only thing that matters about today." She closed the journal. She blew out the candle. She lay in the dark and listened to the city outside her window, and let herself be exactly where she was. She was all right. She was completely, grounded, genuinely all right. She told Francis the following Thursday. They were at their usual table in the bakery, with their usual tea, and Lyra had been deciding since Monday whether to say anything. She had decided not to say anything, and then Francis had looked at her within 30 seconds of sitting down and said, "Something happened." Lyra said, "Yes." She told her. All of it. The corner, the September light, the tea house, what he had said, and what she had said. She told it accurately, without dramatizing it, the way she wrote in her journal. Francis listened without interrupting. This was one of Francis's great gifts, the ability to be completely still while you were telling her something important, so that you felt your own story had room to be exactly what it was. When Lyra finished, Francis said, "How do you feel about it?" Lyra thought about this honestly. She said, "I feel complicated. I feel like I handled it in the way I wanted to handle it, from myself, rather than from old habits. I feel that was important. And I also feel that it reopened something. I thought it was more closed than it is." Francis said, "That is not surprising." Lyra said, "No, I suppose not." Francis turned her teacup in her hands. She said, "What does he want?" Lyra said, "He said he was not asking for anything. He said he came to say what he said. I believed him, I think, in the sense that he meant it when he said it. But I also know that he would not have come across the country simply to give me information." Francis said, "What do you think he would come back for?" Lyra looked out the window at the street. She said, "I think he would come back if I let him. I think that is the question. Whether I want to allow that, and on what terms, and whether I trust myself to know the difference between what I want and what the old habits are pulling toward." Francis said, "Do you think you can trust yourself?" Lyra thought about this for a long time. The street outside was busy with the Thursday market crowd. An elderly man was leading a dog that was pulling cheerfully in 3 different directions. A woman with a basket of bread was arguing with a vendor in a friendly way. She said, "3 years ago I could not have. Now I think I am closer to it. But I also know that this particular person is the one who first taught me the habits I have been trying to unlearn, which means he is the one most likely to trigger them." Francis said, "Yes." Lyra said, "Which means I need to be especially careful, not in the guarded sense, in the awake sense." Francis said, "There is a difference." Lyra said, "Yes, I am very aware of the difference. Being guarded means closing yourself down so that nothing can get through. Being awake means keeping yourself open and choosing consciously what you let in." Francis said, "Which do you think you are right now?" Lyra said, "Awake. I hope." She paid for the tea. They walked out together into the Thursday market noise, and Francis hooked her arm through Lyra's as they moved along the street, which was a thing Francis did sometimes when the moment called for closeness without the fuss of words. They walked half the way home together before their routes diverged. Francis said, when they stopped to part ways, that she was proud of Lyra. She said it simply and meant it, and Lyra felt it land in the way that true things land, when they come from someone who actually knows you. She said, "Thank you. I think I needed to hear that." Francis said, "Come Thursday. Tell me what happens next." Lyra said she would. She walked the rest of the way home alone, in the early afternoon light that comes after a market Thursday, when the streets are slightly quieter than they were, and the air smells of things that have been sold and eaten and carted away. She thought about what she had said to Francis. Awake, not guarded. She thought about what awake meant in practice. It meant feeling the tremor without pretending there was no tremor. It meant acknowledging that Kaylin had walked back into her vicinity, and that this had moved something in her that she had assumed was more settled than it was. It meant sitting with that honestly, rather than managing it into a neater shape. She was still in love with something, she thought. Not with the man exactly. The man had done something that had changed the nature of what she felt. But with what they had been at their best, those years of working alongside each other, That feeling of two minds meeting properly, of being genuinely known in the particular and specific way that only happens with certain people. That thing was not something you fell out of easily. It was not something you were supposed to fall out of easily, because if it had been real, and she believed it had been real, it deserved to be mourned and remembered with honesty. The question was not whether she still felt things. She did. The question was what she did with those feelings, and whether she did it from a place of wisdom or a place of old hunger. She arrived home and made tea. She sat at her desk and looked at the yellow flowers, and did not write anything for a while. She simply sat. She was not afraid. She was alert. Those were different things, and she was glad she could tell the difference now. He had not asked to see her again. He had said he would not ask for anything. She did not know whether that was fully true, or whether it was the most tactful opening, but she did not think she needed to decide that today. Today she only needed to notice what she felt, and not act from it yet. Tomorrow she would go to the society. There was the Eastern Province school letter to write, and 3 new funding proposals to review, and a meeting with Agnes about the spring schedule. The work was real, and ongoing, and important, and it needed her. She was needed, but this time, beautifully and specifically, she was needed by something she had chosen. She drank her tea. The evening came in gently. She sat in her room that was hers, in her life that was hers, and she let herself be quietly, carefully, open. He came back. She was not entirely surprised. She had not been waiting for it. She had been working, which was the thing she did when she needed to stay inside herself. But when Agnes appeared at her office door one morning in early October and said there was a man at the front asking for her, Lyra set her pen down and felt in her chest the particular quality of calm that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from having already thought through the feeling and made peace with it. She went to the front of the building. He was standing near the door, hat in hand, in better clothes than he had been wearing in September, properly laundered, properly fitted. He looked less like a man who had traveled a long distance, and more like a man who had been in the city for a while and was making an effort. She noticed this and filed it. She said, "Come in then." She showed him to the small room they used for meetings, a table, 4 chairs, a window looking out on the side garden. She sat down. He sat down across from her. She said, "I was expecting you to send a letter first." He said, "I thought a letter would give you too easy a way to say no." She looked at him. She said, "That is a very honest answer." He said, "I am trying to be honest. It is something I have been working on." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because I was not, for a long time, not in the ways that mattered. I told myself I was honest. I did not lie about things in the obvious way. I said the true thing when asked directly. But there is a kind of honesty that is about more than not lying. It is about naming things, saying what they are while they are happening, not after they are over. I was not good at that." She said nothing. She folded her hands on the table and let him speak. He said, "I did not tell you what you meant to me when I should have. I told myself it was the wrong time, that the kingdom needed to stabilize first, that there would be a better moment. I told myself this for years, and what I have come to understand, in the time I have had to think about it properly, is that there would never have been a better moment, because I was frightened of naming it. If I named it, I would be accountable to it. And being accountable to something real, something that could be lost, was something I was very afraid of." Lyra said quietly, "So instead you chose something you were less afraid of losing." He met her eyes. He said, "Yes. That is exactly what I did. And it was one of the worst decisions I have ever made, and I knew it before it was fully made, and I made it anyway, because fear is very persuasive when you let it argue with you long enough." She breathed slowly. He said, "I am not here to ask you to forgive me. I am not sure that is something I have the right to ask for. I am here because I want to know you, the person you are now. I want to know her in the way I did not know you properly before, not as the person behind my work, not as the person who solved my problems, but as you, just you." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about everything she had written in her journal over 3 years, the careful, honest excavation of what had gone wrong, and who she had been, and who she was becoming. She thought about the conversations with Francis about what awake looked like versus guarded. She thought about what she had said to him in the tea house. "I am not going to give you an answer today about anything," she said. "I am going to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly, even if the answer is uncomfortable. He said, yes. She said, what are you expecting to happen? If I allow you to know me, as you say, what are you expecting? He was quiet for a moment. He said, I am expecting that it will take time, and that you will not make it easy, and I mean that as an observation, not a complaint. I am expecting that I will have to demonstrate things rather than simply say them. I am expecting that you will be watchful, and that you have earned the right to be watchful, and I think that is correct. As for what happens after, I would be lying if I said I had no hopes. But I also know that my hopes are not the relevant consideration. She said, that is a good answer. He said, it is the true answer. She looked at the table. She looked at her own hands on the table. She thought about the woman she had been who would have felt, at this moment, such enormous relief at these words, who would have gathered them up immediately, and built on them, and made them mean more than they could yet mean, because she had always been so hungry for that specific feeling of being chosen. She was not hungry in that way anymore. That was the thing she was testing in herself right now, sitting across this table, whether the hunger was still driving, or whether she had genuinely arrived at a different place. She found, with a quality of calm that she identified as real rather than performed, that she was not driven by the hunger. She was interested. She was moved, in some honest way, by what he had said. But she was not swept. She was sitting in her chair, at her own table, in her own building, and she was in possession of herself. She said, I will agree to this, on terms that are mine to set.
He said,
yes. What are the terms? She said, I will see you no more than once a week, on a day of my choosing, in a location of my choosing. You will not come to this building without an appointment, and you will not send letters that are long or that ask for things I have not offered. If at any point I tell you that I need to stop, you will stop without argument. He said, yes, all of that, without question. She said, and I want to be clear that I am not making you any promises. I am not agreeing to anything except the opportunity to see who you are now. Whether that becomes something or remains nothing is not a thing I know yet, and I will not pretend to know it. He said, I understand. She said, then I will see you on Saturday. There is a market in the Western Quarter in the morning. I will be there at 10 o'clock. He said, I will be there. She stood. He stood. They did not embrace, did not shake hands. She walked him to the door of the building. He put his hat back on and looked at her once more with the expression she had been reading all these years, and she looked back at him clearly, with all the clarity she had built, and she let the door close between them. She went back to her office and sat down at her desk. Agnes appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, with 2 cups of tea, which she placed on Lyra's desk without being asked. She looked at Lyra with the particular expression of a woman who had seen a great many things, and had opinions about most of them, but knew which ones to keep to herself. She said, the Eastern Province letter is due to the regional office by Thursday. Lyra said, I know. I will have it done tomorrow. Agnes nodded and went back to her own desk. Lyra drank her tea. She picked up her pen and found her place on the Eastern Province letter and continued where she had left off. Her handwriting was steady and clear. Her thoughts, once she was back inside the work, were focused and sequential. She worked through the rest of the morning without distraction. At lunch, she ate at the small table in the back room and read through the funding proposals she had not gotten to that morning, making notes in the margins. She was thorough. She did not rush. In the afternoon, she finished the Eastern Province letter and 2 of the 3 proposals. She left the 3rd on her desk for the morning when she would be fresh. She put on her coat, said goodnight to Agnes, and walked out into the October afternoon. The city was in its autumn mode now, the leaves going, the light lower, the air with that particular edge to it that September lacked. She walked her usual route home, and felt the day as a whole thing. She had been moved, yes. She had been unsettled, yes. She had also held herself with more care and self-knowledge than she had believed herself capable of 3 years ago. And that was worth something. That was worth quite a lot. She bought flowers on the way home. Red ones this time, because the season had changed and something in her felt like red. She put them on her table. She made tea. She opened her journal and wrote for 30 minutes. She wrote, he came back. I was not surprised. I set terms and they were met. I am not afraid. I am not swept. I am curious. There is a difference between those things, and I am very clear on what the difference is. She wrote, I do not know what happens next. I have said that to myself a great deal over the past 3 years, and it has become less frightening each time. Not knowing what happens next is not a danger anymore. It is simply the truth of being alive, which is what it always was. I was just too afraid of it to feel it honestly. She closed the journal and looked at the red flowers. She thought, I am here. I am whole. Whatever comes next comes to someone who knows herself. That was enough. In fact, it was everything. The Saturday market was busy. She arrived at 10 o'clock as she had said, and he was already there, which was something she noted without commentary. He had brought nothing, asked for nothing, was simply standing at the edge of the market in the morning crowd, with the expression of a man who is trying very hard not to look like he is trying very hard. She walked up to him and said good morning, and he said good morning back, and they began to walk through the market together. It was not easy, exactly. There was a quality of effort in the first hour that they both felt and neither acknowledged. She watched him the way she had learned to watch things, with the full attention that sees beneath surfaces, and she noticed things that were different from what she remembered, and things that were the same. He was quieter than he had been, not uncertain quiet but considered quiet, as though he had been practicing listening instead of speaking. He asked questions about the market stalls they passed, about which vendors she preferred and why, in a way that was genuinely interested rather than politely filler. He remembered things she said from one sentence to the next, which was something she was alert to because the old Kalen had sometimes been too inside his own thinking to track what other people were saying properly. She talked about the society. She talked about the Eastern Province School and the funding proposals, and the particular problem she was working on with the Regional Building Authority. She talked about it in the way she talked about it with Francis, fully, with the real details included, not the summarized version she had been in the habit of offering to people who she was not sure were actually interested. He was interested. She could tell the difference. They stopped at a stall that sold cheese and had a conversation about which of 2 regional varieties was better, which devolved into a friendly disagreement that made her laugh before she had decided to, which surprised her. He looked at the sound of it with an expression she recognized, a particular quality of attention that was about more than just the thing in front of him, and she felt the warmth of being seen, and made herself notice that she was feeling it without surrendering to it. She was allowed to feel it. She did not have to either deny it or be consumed by it. It was possible to be moved by something and to remain standing. They walked through the market for 2 hours, and then she said she had things to do in the afternoon, and he said of course, and they parted at the edge of the square. He did not ask about next week. She appreciated that. She walked home and sat at her desk, and did not open her journal immediately. She sat and let the morning sit with her. She thought about the sound of her own laugh. She thought about how long it had been since she laughed in the company of someone who had caused her such pain, and whether that was a problem, or simply the complexity of real things. She concluded it was simply the complexity. Real things were not simple. She had known this, and she knew it better now. She wrote in the journal that evening. She wrote, I felt things today that I was not sure I would feel. I let myself feel them. I watched them, and I did not let them drive. That is all I needed to do today. That is, in fact, a great deal. She did not see him the following Saturday. She sent a note saying she had a work commitment, which was true. The Eastern Province situation had escalated and required her full attention through the weekend. The note was short and factual, and did not apologize. He sent back a single line acknowledging this, with no pressure and no elaboration. She read his response twice and then set it aside and got back to work. The Eastern Province situation resolved in the second week of November, which meant a new school building would be under construction before the winter rains. It was a significant win. Months of letter writing and negotiation and careful positioning finally coming together. Agnes made tea in celebration, which was Agnes's highest form of recognition, and George from the founding committee sent a note of genuine congratulation. Lyra sat at her desk on the afternoon the confirmation arrived, and felt the specific weight of accomplished work. Not pride in herself exactly, but something like the satisfaction of a craftsperson, when the thing they have been building holds together in the way they intended. She wrote to him that week, a short letter, telling him briefly about the school building, and that she was glad the work had concluded. She did not know exactly why she wrote it. She thought perhaps it was because it was a thing she was genuinely pleased about, and she wanted to say it to someone who would understand the context. He wrote back. He said he was glad. He said the work she described sounded like work that would matter for a long time. He said it in a way that was warm and genuine, and that did not attach any other meaning to itself. She folded the letter and put it in the drawer of her desk. She did not analyze it at length, she simply let it be what it was. Weeks passed. They met twice more before the winter settled in properly. Once for tea, once for a walk along the river path on a cold, bright afternoon that smelled of autumn leaves and water. Each time was a little less effortful than the last. Not easier in the sense of being careless, but easier in the sense of becoming more natural, the way a conversation becomes more natural, between two people who are genuinely getting to know each other, rather than managing each other. She told Francis about each one afterward. Francis asked good questions. Lyra answered them honestly. Francis said one Thursday, after Lyra had described the river walk, "You sound like yourself when you talk about it. You do not sound like the person who used to make yourself smaller." Lyra thought about this carefully. She said, "I think that is because I have not been making myself smaller. I have been present, and I have been honest, and when I have needed to hold a boundary, I have held it." "None of those things are small," Francis said. "No, none of them are." She went home that Thursday and made herself dinner, and sat at the table, and ate it, while reading a chapter of the book she was partway through. Just that. She did not write in the journal. She did not analyze. She just ate her dinner, and read her book, and let the evening be ordinary. She was learning that ordinary evenings were one of the great underrated gifts. She had spent so many years in the extraordinary, in crisis and consequence and the constant management of large and complicated things, that she had not properly appreciated the quality of a quiet evening, with good food, and a book, and no one needing anything from her. She appreciated it now. She appreciated it deeply. The last thing she did before she slept was look out the window at the street below, at the familiar houses, and the light from their windows, and the cat that lived 2 doors down, and sat on the same wall every evening, regardless of temperature. She thought, "I like my life." She thought, "I actually like it." She blew out the candle and went to sleep. Winter came properly in December, with cold mornings, and the particular gray light of the short days, and Lyra worked and met with Kaylin on her Saturdays, and did not conflate the two things, which was itself a kind of progress. She had always been good at compartmentalization in the professional sense. What she was practicing now was a different kind, not the suppression of feeling, but the containment of it in a way that allowed her to move through her life without anyone feeling overrunning the others. She felt the warmth she felt when she was with him, and she let it be real, and she went home, and sat at her own table, and made her own tea, and was still, clearly, herself. She thought about this in a journal entry one December evening. She wrote, "The difference between the old pattern and this one is not the feeling. The feeling may be the same, or close to it. The difference is what I do with it. Before, I made the feeling the center, and organized everything around it. Now I let the feeling exist alongside everything else, and I remain the center of my own life." She was glad she had written that. She read it back twice, and thought it was accurate. He was making efforts, she could see. He had found a room in the city, and had enrolled in something Agnes had mentioned was available. An advisory board, for a provincial trade organization, the kind of unglamorous public work that required genuine knowledge, and produced no visibility. She thought about the old Kaylin, who had been very aware of visibility, and the management of appearances, and she found the choice instructive. He was choosing to do useful work that no one would particularly notice. She took note of this without comment. He talked to her differently than he had used to. This was the clearest change, and also the one that cost her the most to admit, because she had believed herself to be the person who understood him best, and here was evidence that the version she had known had been in some ways a younger and less formed version. He was slower to speak now. He did not fill silences with position or conclusion. He asked questions that were genuinely open, not the kind of question that is already half an answer, and when she responded he engaged with what she had actually said, rather than where he had already intended the conversation to go. She thought, "He has been doing some version of the same work I have been doing, from a different starting point, about different things, but the work of becoming more honest, more present, more willing to sit with what is uncomfortable." She recognized it in him, because she knew what it looked like from the inside. She did not tell him she recognized it. She was not yet in the business of reassuring him. It was Francis who pushed her, gently but directly, one Thursday in January. They were at the bakery, and Lyra had been talking about a recent Saturday walk, a long one along the canal, where they had talked for 3 hours without running out of things to say, and Francis had listened with her usual stillness, and then said, "Lyra, what are you afraid of?" Lyra looked at her. She said, "What do you mean?" Francis said, "You are being very careful, which I understand, but I am wondering if the carefulness has become its own kind of distance, and whether the distance is serving you or protecting you from something you actually want." Lyra was quiet for a long moment. She said, "I am afraid of giving myself away again." Francis said, "Yes, I know. But there is a difference between giving yourself away and letting someone in. You know that difference in theory. I am wondering if you are letting yourself practice it." Lyra looked out the window. The January street was gray and quiet. A man was walking a dog past the window, and the dog was wearing a small coat, which made her want to smile. She said, "I think I have been being careful in a way that is both genuinely wise and also sometimes a reason not to take a risk." Francis said, "Yes." She said, "I do not want to be the person who uses self-knowledge as a shield against living." Francis said, "No, that would be a waste of very good self-knowledge." She walked home more slowly than usual that afternoon, thinking about what Francis had said. She thought about the canal walk, about 3 hours of conversation that had felt genuinely easy, not effortful, not managed, just easy, the way conversation is easy when you are talking to someone whose mind you respect, and who respects yours in return. She thought about the specific way he had laughed at something she said, not politely, but genuinely, in that surprised way that means you have caught someone off guard. She thought, "I am waiting to be safe," and she thought, "I will never be fully safe." That is not the nature of living alongside someone. There is always the possibility of loss, and the possibility of being hurt. The question is whether the person across from you is someone who takes that risk seriously. The question is whether you are too. She got home. She made tea. She sat at her desk. She did not open the journal. She sat for a while and thought. Then she wrote a note, short, direct, in her own hand, and folded it, and put it in an envelope. The note said, "I would like to have dinner with you on Saturday. Not the market, not a walk. Dinner at a proper table, the kind that takes 2 hours and means something. Tell me where you think is right." She sealed it and left it on the table to post in the morning. Then she felt the particular combination of exhilaration and calm that comes from having made a clear decision from yourself, and she drank her tea, and she went to bed. His reply came the following afternoon. He named a restaurant near the river, the kind of place that was neither showy nor casual, genuinely good food in a room with enough space between tables for real conversation. He named a time. He said, "I am glad." She read it once. She put it in the drawer. She got back to work. The rest of the week passed in its usual way. She wrote the provincial correspondence and attended a funding meeting and helped Agnes organize the spring schedule and had lunch with Francis on Thursday and did not mention the note or the reply. Francis noticed but did not ask, which was one of the many reasons Lyra valued her. Saturday arrived the way it always did, suddenly, after the week that had stretched it out. She dressed in a way she had not dressed in years, taking care in the way she used to take care for important meetings at the palace, which she supposed this was. She looked at herself in the mirror and thought, "This is still me, the woman in better clothes, with her hair done properly, who is going to dinner with someone she has complicated feelings about. She is still me. The clothes do not erase the person." She walked to the restaurant. She arrived on time, which she always did, and he was already there, which he always was. They sat down. They ordered. And then, freed from the movement of a walk and the noise of a market, they simply talked. They talked about his childhood, which she had known in broad strokes but not in the detail he offered now. A story of a father who had been formidable and distant and deeply lonely, who had never figured out how to ask for what he needed from the people who loved him, and who had passed this incapacity on to his son without meaning to. He spoke about it without self-pity and without using it as an excuse, which she thought was the only honest way to speak about the things we inherit from our parents. She told him things in return, about her mother, about the exhaustion she had watched her mother carry, about the way she had absorbed that model and replicated it so faithfully that it had taken her nearly 30 years to recognize it as a model, rather than simply the way things were. She said, "I spent a long time thinking that love was something you earned by being needed. I have had to learn from scratch what it looks like to be wanted rather than useful." He said, "I did not recognize, while you were there, how much I was relying on your usefulness as a substitute for the harder work of actually choosing you. I think a part of me believed that because you were always there, you would always be there. That is not a kind thought to have about a person, and I am sorry for it." She looked at him across the table in the low evening light of the restaurant, and she thought, "This is the most honest he has ever been with me. And it has taken 3 years and a great deal of loss for both of us to get here." She said, "I believe you." He said, "I need you to know that this is not about what I need from you now. I am managing on my own. I am doing the unglamorous work. I am not here because I have a kingdom to run and require someone to run alongside me. I am here because I know who you are, and I want the chance to know who you are now, and if you will allow it, to have you know who I am trying to become." She sat with this. She thought about the girl who had walked into his office at 21 with files under her arm. She thought about the woman who had stood in the cold morning light on the palace terrace and understood, for the first time, what she had to do. She thought about the months of illness, and the print house, and Edmund, and the society, and Francis, and Bess's bedtime stories, and yellow flowers, and red flowers, and 3 years of becoming herself. She thought, "I know what I will and will not accept. I know how to walk away, if what I need is not here. I know that I will survive this, whatever it becomes, because I have already survived the worst version of it. And I know that refusing to risk anything is its own kind of damage." She said, "I hear you." She said, "I am not making promises tonight. But I want you to know that I am here because I chose to be, and I am paying attention, and what you just said matters to me." He nodded. They finished their dinner. They walked out into the winter night, the city quiet around them at this hour, their breath visible in the cold air. He walked her as far as the corner of her street, which she had said was where he should stop. He stopped there. He said goodnight. She said goodnight. She walked the rest of the way home alone, and the silence around her was not empty. It was full of everything the evening had been. She let it be full. She walked slowly, and let the night air be cold on her face. She was not swept. She was not guarded. She was awake, and she was moving forward, and that was the truest thing she could say about where she was. The new year arrived, and with it the particular quality of January that always felt to Lyra like a fresh page in a large book. Not a beginning exactly, because beginnings required more drama than a simple calendar turn, but a moment of orientation, a chance to assess where you stood and what you were carrying. She stood at her desk on the first working day of the year, and looked at the spread of projects and proposals and correspondence that constituted her work, and she felt, as she had been feeling more consistently for the past year, the clean weight of work that was both genuinely demanding and genuinely hers. The society had grown. They had now funded 6 schools across 3 provinces and had 3 more in various stages of planning. Agnes had taken on an assistant. George had found 2 new funding partners who were serious people doing this for the right reasons. Lyra had been instrumental in all of it, but instrumental in a way that she could see clearly and be proud of, because she had done it from a position of knowing who she was and what she was good at, not from a position of needing to be needed. The distinction was everything. She and Kaylin had dinner again in January, and then in February. They had moved into a rhythm that was comfortable without being careless. She set the pace, he kept it, and there was a growing ease between them that came from genuine knowledge, rather than from the old intimacy of constant proximity. She was learning him again, or rather learning the version of him that had been formed by the same 3 years that had formed her. The versions were different from the ones they had been. She thought that was probably good. He told her one evening about the moment he had understood he had made an irreversible mistake, not the moment of the announcement. He had known then that he was doing something he would regret, had known it with the very particular clarity that comes from doing something while aware you should not. The irreversible moment had come later, several months into the betrothal, when he had been trying to solve a problem in the northern provinces, and had found himself thinking, automatically and without meaning to, Lyra would know what to do with this. And the thought had landed with such force, such specific grief, that he had had to set the papers down and sit with it, with the full weight of what he had chosen, and what he had given up. She listened to this carefully. She said, "I am glad you told me that." He said, "I am glad I could." She said, "I am not going to tell you it was fine, because it was not fine. But I believe you mean what you say." He said, "I do, and I know that believing me is not the same as forgiving me, and I am not asking for the second thing." She said, "I know. That is why I can give you the first." She drove home that evening. She had begun renting a small horse and trap for the longer evenings, because the winter nights were cold and dark, and she sat in the lamplight of the trap and thought about what she had just said. "I believe you. I can give you the first." She thought about the young woman she had been who had believed so completely and had found the belief did not protect her. She thought about the work she had done to arrive at a belief that was not blind, not offered from the desperate place of wanting to be loved, but offered because she had watched carefully and weighed honestly and arrived at a considered judgment. This was different. She knew it was different because it felt different in the body, not the reaching, feverish hope of the old love, but something slower and better rooted. She thought, "I am trusting myself to know the difference, and I do know the difference, and that is not a small thing." She got home and fed the fire and made tea and sat in the chair by the window that had become her thinking chair, the one where she did her best, most honest thinking, the one she had sat in on many difficult evenings over the past years. She sat in it now and breathed, and let herself feel what she was feeling, which was complex and layered and not easily named, but which had underneath it something she recognized as real, not performed, not constructed, real. She thought about writing in the journal and then decided not to. Some feelings did not need to be written immediately. Some things were allowed simply to exist inside you for a while, before you had to make them into words. She sat. The fire burned. The city was quiet outside. She was 30 years old, and she had come a long distance from the girl who had walked out of the palace with one bag, and she was still going, still becoming, still making her way toward the person she intended to be. She was in no hurry. For the first time in a very long time, she was genuinely in no hurry at all. She sat until the fire died down, and the tea went cold and the evening turned to night, and she sat in the dark for a while, without lighting another candle, because the dark felt comfortable, because she was not afraid of it anymore, because she had spent enough time in difficult and uncertain places to know that she was someone who could hold her own in the dark. She could. She always had been. She just hadn't known it until she had to find out for herself. Spring came again, and with it a specific kind of testing that she had not anticipated. She had expected, if things continued between her and Kaylin, that the testing would come from within herself, that she would have to keep watching her own patterns, keep checking whether the old habits were reasserting themselves, keep ensuring that she was present in the new way, rather than reverting to the old way. She had expected to be her own primary challenge. She had not fully anticipated the challenge that would come from other people. She heard about it first from Agnes, who had heard it from someone connected to the palace circles, which was how things moved in a city where the palace was still the largest single weight on the social landscape. The rumor, which turned out to be true, because almost everything did, was that Kaylin had declined a significant political opportunity that would have required him to return to the palace in an official advisory capacity. The opportunity had come from the new administration, people who had been watching his provincial work and thought his experience was relevant. He had said no. Agnes told her this, as a piece of incidental news, not knowing its relevance. Lyra heard it and said nothing. She filed it. She asked him about it the following Saturday. They were having coffee at a small place near the society building. She had taken to suggesting locations near her own work, rather than always meeting in the middle, because this was also part of the new order of things, the understanding that her time and her geography mattered equally. He had come without complaint. She said, "I heard you decline something from the palace." He looked at her with the directness she had come to expect and said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because accepting it would have pulled me back into a structure I spent 3 years understanding was not working. It would have put me in a position with different demands and different pressures, and I would be less able to give proper attention to the things I am actually trying to build here. And I think you know the other reason." She said, "Say it." He said, "Because I am building something here that matters more to me than anything they were offering, and I did not want to do anything that would jeopardize that. She looked at him. She said, I want you to understand something. I do not want you making decisions about your life around the question of what will or will not jeopardize things with me. That is not how I want things to work. I have spent years being the person that other people's decisions were made around, and I will not be that for you in reverse. He said, I understand, but this was not that. This was a choice between two directions, and I chose the one that was true to what I actually want, independent of you. You are a reason, but you are not the reason. She thought about this. She said, explain the difference. He said, if the only reason I declined was you, then I am organizing my life around you the way you told me you organized yours around me, and that is not healthy for either of us. But if I declined because the work I am doing here is genuinely what I want to be doing, and the life I am building here is the life I actually want, and you happen to be here too, then you are part of a whole, not the whole itself. She was quiet for a moment. She said, that is a very clear answer. He said, I have been practicing giving clear answers. She picked up her coffee. She said, good. Continue practicing. They left the coffee place and walked for a while in the spring morning. The city was waking up to warmth after the long winter. Flowers in the market stalls, the particular high spirits of people who have endured cold and are now in the first real heat of a new season. She thought about what he had said. She turned it over and examined it the way she examined proposals at the society, looking for the weak point, the place where the logic failed or the claim was overstated. She could not find one. What he had described was a genuine distinction, and he had articulated it clearly, and that clarity itself was evidence of the work he said he had been doing. She was not going to hand him the city keys on the basis of one clear answer, but she was going to note it. She noted a great many things in the weeks that followed. She noted that when he was uncertain about something, he said so, rather than finding a way to speak around the uncertainty. She noted that when they disagreed, and they disagreed with some regularity, because they had always had different instincts about certain things, he engaged with the disagreement directly, rather than managing her toward his position, which was what he had done in the old days with his advisors, and sometimes with her too. She noted that he remembered things she mentioned in passing, and followed up on them in later conversations, which meant he was listening in the full sense. She noted that when she was difficult, and she was sometimes difficult, deliberately, testing the thing that most needed testing, he did not become cold, or distant, or subtly punishing. He held his ground when he thought he was right, acknowledged it when he thought he was wrong, and did not make either of those things into a crisis. She told Francis about this testing, because she told Francis about most things. Francis said, "You are being quite rigorous." Lyra said, "I am aware of that." Francis said, "Is the rigor still serving you, or is it starting to become its own obstacle?" Lyra said, "I think there is still some more rigor required, but I also think I am getting close to the end of the testing phase." Francis said, "What comes after the testing phase?" Lyra said, "I have not fully decided, but I think it involves saying some things out loud that I have only written in my journal so far." Francis looked at her. She said, "That sounds like something." Lyra said, "It is." In early April, on a Saturday, that was one of those unexpectedly warm days that appeared in spring like an early gift, they had been walking in the botanical gardens near the University District. It was a place Lyra had discovered in her first year in the city and had returned to often. Big trees, old ones, with the particular quality of patience that very old trees have, a pond, benches, children running on the grass with the specific abandon of children who have been kept inside by winter. They had been talking about something she could no longer quite recall, something from the news, something about provincial policy, and then they had stopped on a path, and she had said, without having planned it, without any preparation at all, "I love you. I want you to know that I do. I have not said it before now because I needed to be sure I was saying it from the right place, and I am sure now. It is from the right place. It is not from fear, and it is not from habit, and it is not from need. It is from choosing." He went very still. She looked at him calmly. She was not waiting for a particular response. She was not holding her breath. She had said the true thing, and it was out in the world now, and she felt the specific lightness of having said the truth. He said, "I have been in love with you since I was 24 years old, and I am sorrier than I have words for, that it took me until now to be someone worthy of hearing you say that." She nodded. She said, "I know. I believe that." They stood on the path for a moment, the old trees above them, the children running somewhere nearby, the warm, early April light coming through the leaves in shifting patterns on the ground. He reached out and took her hand, carefully, asking the question with the gesture. She let him. His hand was warm and familiar in a way that surprised her, not because she had forgotten what it felt like, but because it felt like something that had been waiting, rather than something that was already gone. They walked on through the gardens, side by side. She did not lose herself. This was the thing she monitored, because she had promised herself she would. She monitored it, and found, with real relief, that she was still entirely herself, still Lyra, who ran the society, and had lunch with Francis, and bought yellow flowers, and sat in the thinking chair by the window. She was all of those things, and she was also here, in the gardens, with her hand in his, and those things were simultaneously true, and she contained them all, without any of them requiring her to diminish the others. This was what it was supposed to feel like. She had known it theoretically. Now she knew it from the inside. She had been right to wait. She had been right to take 3 years to build the self she needed, to be able to stand in this moment, and feel what she felt, without being consumed by it. She squeezed his hand once, briefly. He looked at her. She said, "I have somewhere to be this afternoon." "The society," he said. "Of course." She said, "I will see you next Saturday." He said, "I will be there." She let go of his hand, and walked in the direction of her building, through the gardens, in the spring light, at her own pace. She arrived at the society to find Agnes in a minor crisis, involving a misfiled funding application, and a deadline that was closer than anticipated. She set her coat down, looked at the situation, and began working through it, with the calm precision that had always been her most reliable quality. She found the application. She confirmed the deadline. She wrote 3 letters in rapid succession to the right people, with the right information, framed in the right way. Agnes watched this and said, when it was done, "I do not know what I would do without you." Lyra said, "You managed before I arrived, but I am glad to be useful." She meant it. She was glad to be useful. That had not changed, and she did not want it to change. Usefulness was a genuine pleasure, a way of being in the world that she valued. What had changed was the difference between usefulness as service to herself and her own purposes, and usefulness as the price of being allowed to stay somewhere. She was useful here because she chose to be, because the work mattered to her, because Agnes and George and the society were a community she had built relationships within, not a place she was managing herself into belonging. She stayed until early evening, got the filing situation resolved, and walked home through the spring dusk. The city was lovely at this hour, the light going warm and long, people at the end of their days moving through the streets with the slightly loosened quality of an afternoon finished, dogs being walked, children being gathered home. She walked slowly. She let the day be large. She thought about the garden, about his hand in hers, about what she had said. She felt it still, not as an upheaval but as a warmth, something settled and real sitting in the center of her chest. She thought about how different it felt from the love she had felt in her 20s, which had been bright and anxious, and so much about what would happen next. This was slower, more grounded, like the difference between a spark and a sustained fire. She got home. She made tea. She sat in the thinking chair. She opened her journal for the first time in several weeks. She had been writing less frequently, she noticed. Not because there was less happening, but because there was less that needed to be processed. The writing had always been a way of working through things that were unresolved, of finding clarity in what was murky. Things were less murky now. She did not need the journal in the same urgent way she once had. She wrote anyway. She wrote, "I told him I loved him today. From the right place. I felt myself throughout. That is the thing I would have told the younger version of myself, if I could have. It is possible to love someone, and to remain yourself. It is possible to open towards someone without giving yourself away. I know this now because I have done it." She wrote, "I have spent 4 years building myself. I did not know when I walked out of the palace with one bag that this was what I was doing, but it was. I was building the person who could stand in a garden on a spring afternoon and say the true thing from a position of strength. That person required work. She required time and honesty and help, and failure and grief, and patience. She required yellow flowers and a small room, and a print house, and a good employer, and a better friend, and work that mattered, and mornings where she was allowed to come slowly to the day. She wrote, "She was worth building." She read that back. She let it stand. She closed the journal and sat for a while in the quiet of the thinking chair. The tea went warm, and then cooler. The light outside the window changed through its evening sequence. She did not light the candle. She sat and breathed, and let herself be what she was, a woman who had been through a great deal, and had come out the other side of it into something genuinely good. Not perfect, nothing was perfect, and she did not require perfection, but good, real, chosen and choosing. She thought about the next steps, which were practical and visible, and did not require her to figure them out tonight. She would see Kaylin on Saturday. They would continue doing what they had been doing, which was building something real and careful and honest. She would continue at the society, which was growing in ways that required more of her rather than less, and she welcomed that. She would have lunch with Francis on Thursday. She would see Clara's daughters, who had in 4 years become something close to the sisters she had not had. She would live her life. That was the plan. The same plan it had been since the morning she walked out of the palace. Except now, it was not a plan born from loss. Now it was a plan born from knowledge. Knowledge of what she was worth and what she needed, and what she would and would not accept, and the absolute steady confidence that she could build and sustain and choose well. She got up from the chair. She lit the candle and put the journal back on the shelf. She stood at the window for a moment and looked out at the street below. The familiar houses, the familiar light, the familiar cat on its wall. She had stood at this window many times in 4 years, in all weathers and all moods, at all hours of the night and morning. She had never quite stood at it feeling what she felt now, which was simply, fully, unreservedly at home. She turned from the window. She went to make dinner. She hummed something while she worked, a song she had not consciously thought of in years, just a melody that came up from somewhere and seemed to fit the evening. She was 30 years old. She had made herself. And the making was good. She had not expected the letter from the palace. It arrived on a Tuesday in May, 4.5 years after she had walked through the side gate with one bag. The seal was the official seal of the Royal Administrative Office, not a personal one, and she turned it over twice before opening it with the calm composure of someone who has spent enough time with difficult surprises that surprises no longer entirely derail her. The letter was signed by a woman named Audrey, who held the position Lyra had once occupied. Not the same title, because the title had apparently been restructured in the intervening years, but the same essential function. Audrey wrote that she was reaching out on behalf of the royal administration, which was undertaking a review of its organizational systems, and that several people had suggested that Lyra might be willing to consult, not to return, not to take a formal position, simply to advise, if she was willing, on certain structural matters where her historical knowledge and current expertise in educational administration would be relevant. Lyra read the letter twice. She set it on her desk and went on with her morning work. She mentioned it to Agnes at midday, not because she needed Agnes's opinion on whether to respond, but because she had learned over 4 years that sharing important things with the people in her life was part of belonging to those people, rather than managing herself alone through everything. Agnes listened. Agnes said, "What do you want to do?" Lyra said, "I am thinking about it." Agnes said, "Do you want to?" Lyra said, "I am not sure. There is a part of me that wants to say no reflexively, because the reflexive no feels safe. And there is another part of me that thinks the reflexive no might not be the right answer just because it feels safe." Agnes said, "That sounds like a you problem that you will figure out." She said it in a way that was entirely non-judgmental and entirely confident in Lyra's ability to do so, which was one of the things Lyra valued most about Agnes. She told Kaylin about it on Saturday. They were at the river again. They had developed several regular routes, all of which Lyra had chosen, which was still how she preferred to operate. The river path in spring was one of the best places in the city. The water caught the light, and the trees were full, and there was a particular quality of peace about moving alongside a large thing that continued, regardless of what happened to the people beside it. She told him, and he listened without his expression changing. He said, "What do you want to do?" She said, There you all are, asking me the same question. He said, "It is the right question." She said, "Yes, I know it is. That is why I keep returning to it." She had been returning to it all week. She had been honest with herself about the layers of it. There was the obvious layer, which was the question of whether she had the time and whether the work would be genuinely useful. That layer was manageable. The deeper layer was more complicated. She said, "I am trying to figure out whether going back in any capacity would pull me toward old patterns, or whether I have changed enough that it would not. I am trying to figure out whether my hesitation is wisdom, or whether it is a reflex of fear that I have been confusing with wisdom." He said, "What is the difference when you examine it?" She said, "Wisdom says, this may cost you more than it gives, and you should weigh that carefully. Fear says, do not do this because it might hurt. Wisdom can say, do not do this, and be right, but fear can also say, do not do this, and be very wrong." He said, "Yes." She said, "I think I have to go and see. Not to take the position, not to enter any formal relationship with that institution, but to go and have the conversation with this woman Audrey and see what is actually being asked, and to see how I feel while I am in the building, and to make the decision from that." He said, "That sounds right." She said, "The last time I was in that building, I walked out without looking back." He said, "Yes." She said, "I am ready to look back now, I think. Not to return to it, just to look at it clearly." They walked in silence for a moment. She said, "Will you come with me?" He looked at her. She said, "Not inside, not into the meeting. I do not need that. But, nearby, somewhere I can find you afterward and tell you about it." He said, "Yes, wherever you need me to be." The meeting was arranged for the following Friday morning. She told Francis about it on Thursday, and Francis said very little, only that she was proud of Lyra for going, and that she had better come to lunch immediately afterward and tell her everything. She arrived at the palace on Friday morning at the appointed hour. She had not been back in 4.5 years. She stood outside the main administrative entrance for a moment before going in, taking in the building she had known for 6 years of her life. It was the same. The stone was the same. The gate was the same. The sounds of the courtyard were the same. It was a building. It did not have power over her. She had given it power once, by making it the container for her entire life. But she was standing outside it now, with a life that had nothing to do with its walls, and it was simply a building. She went in. The meeting with Audrey was businesslike and thoughtful. Audrey was capable and clear-eyed, and genuinely interested in improving the organizational systems she had inherited, which were, as Lyra could immediately see, somewhat less well organized than they had been when she left. Audrey did not pretend otherwise. She showed Lyra specific problems and asked specific questions, and listened carefully to the answers. It was a good meeting. Lyra noticed, throughout it, how she felt. She felt professionally engaged, which was genuine. She felt the familiar pleasure of a well-organized problem being examined with the right tools. She did not feel the old pull, the pull of belonging here, the pull of being needed by this place, the particular magnetic quality the palace had once had for her. She felt, very clearly, like a consultant, someone brought in from outside to look at a specific problem and offer a considered view. That was exactly right. That was exactly what she was. She offered to provide written recommendations based on what she had seen today, and she named a reasonable consulting fee, which she had decided on in advance, because charging for her expertise was part of understanding its value. Audrey accepted without negotiation. She walked out of the administrative entrance at midday. The courtyard was busy with the ordinary traffic of a palace at midday. Servants, officials, the occasional visitor. She walked through it without stopping. Kalen was at the tea house, 2 streets from the palace gate, as she had asked him to be. He was at a table by the window with 2 cups of tea already ordered, which was the right thing to do, and she noted it. She sat down. He looked at her. She said, "I am fine. Better than fine." He said, "Tell me." She told him. She told him about Audrey, and the meeting, and the problems she had been shown, and the recommendations she intended to make. She told him about standing outside the building, and what she had felt. She told him about walking through the courtyard, and the specific absence she had noticed, the absence of the old weight, the old pull. She said, "It is just a building now." He said, That sounds like a very good development. She said, It is. She picked up her tea. Outside the window, the street went about its business. She felt clear. That was the best word for it. Clear in the way the air is clear after very long rain. Not empty but transparent, so that you can see through it to what is actually there. She thought about 21-year-old Lyra walking into that building for the first time, with files under her arm. She thought about 27-year-old Lyra walking out of it with one bag. She thought about the 4.5 years between that leaving and this morning. All the work, and the grief, and the growing, and the becoming. She thought about what she had said in the garden in April, from the right place, freely, without fear. She thought, I am the person I was always supposed to be. It simply took longer than I expected, and it cost more than was fair, and I am here anyway. She finished her tea. She said she had a lunch appointment with Francis and needed to go. He said he understood. She stood, put on her coat. He said her name. She looked at him. He said, You are extraordinary. She said, I know. I have known that for some time. I spent a good while forgetting it, and the past 4 years remembering it, and I do not intend to forget it again. She said it lightly, with a smile at the end of it. He smiled back in the way that had always undone her, and still did, if she was honest, but in a different way now. Not undone in the sense of lost, but undone in the sense of moved, in the sense of feeling something real and letting herself feel it, without using it as a reason to disappear into someone else. She walked to the door. She turned back once. She said, Thursday. I will see you Thursday. He said, I will be there. She walked out. The city opened around her. She walked to Francis's favorite bakery through the May streets, through the warmth and the noise, and the ordinary beautiful complication of a city in the middle of its day, and she felt everything she was, all of it, the whole person, the girl who had once given everything, and the woman who had learned the difference between giving and losing herself. Francis was at the table already. She looked up when Lyra came in and said, Well? Lyra sat down. She took off her coat. She let the morning settle on her like something earned. She said, I went. I stayed myself the whole time. I am consulting for them, briefly, at a proper fee, and I am having lunch with you right now. Francis looked at her for a long moment. She said, You are so different from the person I met 4 years ago. Lyra said, Yes. She said, I mean that as the highest praise I have ever given anyone. Lyra said, I know. I take it as such. They ordered. They ate. They talked about 100 things, as they always did, as women who know each other well talk, in spirals and layers, in laughter and seriousness, and back to laughter again, with the ease of people who have stood beside each other, through enough hard things, that the easy things are doubly good. And in the middle of that lunch, at the usual table in the usual bakery, in the city that had become her home, Lyra felt something so simple and so complete that she did not have a particular word for it. She thought, This is a life. Not a life that had arrived without cost, not a life that had been given to her, a life she had built from the ground up, from one bag and a small room, and the decision to stop waiting for someone to choose her, and to start choosing herself. A life with real work in it, and real love in it, and real friendship in it, and the particular dignity that comes from knowing your own worth and not being willing to trade it for anything less than something that matches it. She was 30 years old, and she was just beginning. And she was not afraid of any of it. She finished lunch with Francis and walked home in the May afternoon, with the feeling of a day that had been fully used. Not used up, there was a difference. A used-up day left you flat and empty. A fully used day left you with the good tiredness that comes from having been genuinely present in every part of it. She had been genuinely present since she woke that morning. She had been present going into the palace, and present in the meeting with Audrey, and present at the tea house with Kaylin, and present at this lunch. She was present now, walking through the afternoon, noticing the quality of the light and the sounds of the street, and the particular pleasure of her own footsteps on a familiar route. This, she thought, was what she had been working toward without knowing it when she left the palace with one bag. She had been working toward the capacity to be present in her own life, to inhabit it fully, not to manage it from a careful distance, not to give the best of herself to something else and then arrive home to the remainder. She arrived home. The room she lived in now was different from the one she had rented in her first week in the city. Larger, with a proper writing desk and a bookshelf that had filled up over 4 years with the books she had been accumulating. She had her own small sitting room with the thinking chair. She had a kitchen where she cooked actual meals rather than surviving on whatever was easiest. The yellow flowers were on the table, a fresh bunch from the Saturday market. She put the kettle on. She stood in the kitchen while the water heated and thought about the day. She thought about the palace and how it had felt like just a building now, which was both a small thing and a very large one. She thought about Kaylin at the tea house with 2 cups of tea already waiting, because he had learned the way she preferred things and had done the thing without being asked. She thought about Francis saying, "You are so different from the person I met 4 years ago." She was. She was so different that sometimes she could barely connect the person she was now to the person she had been when she arrived in this city, on a morning in September, 4.5 years ago, exhausted and bereft, and carrying one bag and a journal, and a very small, cautious, stubborn belief that she might be more than what she had been allowed to be. She had been right about that. The cautious, stubborn belief had been correct. She made her tea, and sat in the thinking chair. She did not open the journal. She just sat. She thought about all the moments that had led here. The morning after the announcement when she packed the bag, the first room with the bare walls, Clara and her daughters and the music lesson sounds on Tuesday evenings, Edmund and the print house and the smell of ink, Francis at the bakery, Agnes and the society, and the Eastern Province School. The 3 years of slow and honest building, the September afternoon when Kaylin had appeared at the corner, and she had felt the tremor and remained standing. She thought about the garden in April, the old trees, the light through the leaves, the things she had said from the right place. She thought about this morning, standing outside the palace, knowing it was just a building. She thought, it was all necessary, even the worst of it, even the parts she would not have chosen. Even the illness and the grief and the particular winter nights when the loneliness had been so specific and so heavy that she had not been sure she could carry it to morning. All of it had been building the person sitting in this chair right now. She thought about what she would say to the girl who had walked out of the palace 4.5 years ago, if she could reach back and say something. She thought about it carefully, because she believed in accuracy. She would say, "You are correct to leave. You are correct about all of it. The loss is real, and the grief is real, and it will take longer than you expect, and cost more than seems fair. And you will be glad, eventually, that it cost what it cost, because the building of yourself requires the materials of difficulty, and you will have what you need. You will find a room that is yours, and work that is yours, and friends who see you, and a life that fits. And you will understand, when you have it, that this was what you were always building toward, even when you thought you were only surviving." She would say, "You are more than enough. You always were. You just needed to be somewhere where the enough was for you." She would say, "The yellow flowers are your idea. No one tells you to buy them. You just want them, and you get them, and they are on your table every week for 4 years, and that small, ordinary pleasure is one of the best things you do for yourself." She would say, "Keep going. It gets better in ways that are better than you can currently imagine." She sat in the thinking chair until the evening came in through the window, gradual and gentle, the May evening light going from gold to blue to the deep near dark of dusk. She sat without lighting a candle. She let the dark come slowly, and sat in it comfortably, the way you can sit in a dark room when you are at home, and you know exactly where everything is. She was at home. She knew exactly where everything was. She knew who she was, which was the most important location of all. She had lost it for years without knowing she had lost it, had been wandering in someone else's landscape calling it her own. And then she had found it again, not in a single moment, but in 1,000 small ones, in choices and losses and rebuildings, in journals and flowers, and good work and honest friendship, and the slow accumulation of days that were genuinely, unambiguously hers. She had found herself. And she was, finally and fully and without reservation, glad.